Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of history's most intimate and forbidden archives, a collection of love letters so scandalous, so passionate, and so politically dangerous that some were hidden for centuries, burned to protect reputations, or locked away in secret royal vaults, never meant to be opened. We're going to read together the actual words that royal mistresses wrote to the kings who loved them, exploring letters that range from heartbreakingly tender to shockingly explicit, from politically astute to desperately pleading. Letters that reveal not just illicit romance, but the complex reality of women who wielded enormous power through love while occupying positions that society despised. Before we dive into these forbidden love letters that changed the course of history, I'd love it if you could hit that subscribe button. It really helps me continue creating these bedtime history stories for you. I am genuinely curious, where are you right now? Are you tucked in bed, perhaps thinking about love letters you've written or received, or are you relaxing somewhere private where you can listen to stories about passion and power, romance and scandal? Tonight, I want you to appreciate the freedom you have to love whom you choose, to express your feelings openly. Freedoms that the women whose letters we'll read tonight never fully had. Women who loved kings but could never be queens, who wielded enormous influence but lived in constant fear of abandonment and ruin. Wherever you are, I want you to dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's travel through centuries of royal courts to read over the shoulders of history's most famous mistresses, as they poured their hearts onto paper, writing words that were never meant for our eyes, but that reveal truths about love, power, and survival that still resonate today. What if I told you that one of the most powerful women in French history, a woman who influenced everything from war to art to revolution, wrote love letters to her king that were so explicit, so detailed in their descriptions of physical passion, that when they were finally discovered centuries later, scholars debated whether they could even be published? What if I told you that a British king's mistress wrote letters begging him for money in terms so desperate and humiliating that reading them today is almost painful, revealing the precarious economic reality beneath the glamorous surface of royal favour? What if I told you that some royal mistresses were so politically astute that their love letters contained coded messages about military strategy and diplomatic negotiations, making them essentially spy correspondence disguised as romantic declarations? According to research by Professor Catherine Fleming from the University of Cambridge, whose work on royal correspondence examines letters and power, the love letters between royal mistresses and their kings are among history's most valuable documents, revealing not just personal relationships, but the hidden mechanisms of political power, the role of women in governance, and the intersection of love, sex, and statecraft in ways that official court records never could. Think about that for a moment. You are going to spend tonight with me reading actual love letters written by royal mistresses to kings, exploring the words these women wrote in moments of passion, fear, joy, desperation, and political calculation, understanding the contexts in which these letters were written and what they reveal about the women who wrote them and the men who received them. This isn't going to be just a collection of romantic excerpts, though there will be plenty of romance. This is going to be an exploration of power and vulnerability, of women who used their pens as weapons and tools and lifelines, of relationships that shaped history even though they existed outside the bounds of law and respectability, and of the extraordinary courage and skill it took to navigate life as a royal mistress in eras when one wrong word could mean exile, poverty, or worse. Let me tell you about Madame de Pompadour, born Jeanne Antoinette Poisson in 1721 in Paris, who became the official mistress of King Louis XIV of France from 1745 until her death in 1764, and who wrote some of the most politically astute and emotionally complex love letters in history. According to research by Professor Elise Goodman from the University of Cincinnati, whose work on Madame de Pompadour examines her life and influence, Pompadour was not just a king's mistress, but essentially a minister of state without portfolio influencing appointments. shaping foreign policy, and controlling access to the king for nearly 20 years, and the letters she wrote to Louis V Bind, preserved in the French National Archives and analysed by Goodman, reveal a woman who understood perfectly how to blend romantic devotion with political purpose, how to keep a king's love while advancing her own agenda, and how to survive in a position that was simultaneously one of the most powerful and most precarious in France. One of Pompadour's letters from 1745, shortly after she became Louis Xv's official mistress, demonstrates her skill at combining personal affection with political awareness. According to Goodman's analysis of this letter preserved in the Archives Nationales, Pompadour wrote to Louis, Monday, cher ami. I write to you not as your subject, though I am that, nor as your servant, though I live to serve you, but as the woman who loves you beyond reason and beyond wisdom. The court whispers that I am merely your amusement, that my influence will fade with my youth and beauty. Let them whisper. I know what they cannot see, that you and I are bound not just by passion, which is fleeting, but by understanding, which endures. I do not offer you only my body, though that is yours completely. I offer you my mind, my loyalty, my absolute devotion to your happiness and your glory. The ministers may advise you on matters of state, but I will advise you on matters of the heart. And is that not equally important for a king who must rule with both authority and humanity? What makes this letter so remarkable, according to Goodman, is how Pompadour positions herself not as a mere sexual partner, but as an intellectual and emotional companion whose value to the king transcends physical attraction. She acknowledges the precariousness of her position. The court whispers about her being just an amusement, but she immediately asserts her unique value by claiming to offer something the king cannot get from his ministers or his wife: understanding, emotional support, and advice on matters of the heart. According to Goodman, this was Pompadour's strategy throughout their relationship, to make herself indispensable not just as a lover but as a confidante and advisor, and her letters consistently reinforced this positioning. Another letter from Pompadour, written in 1752 during a period when their sexual relationship had apparently ended, but she remained his closest companion, reveals even more about her understanding of power and her skill at maintaining influence, even as the basis of the relationship changed. According to Goodman's analysis, Pompadour wrote to Louis, My dearest friend, the world believes that a woman who no longer shares your bed must lose your favour and your trust. But we know better, you and I. What we have built together is stronger than passion, more enduring than youth, more precious than any physical pleasure. I am no longer your mistress in the way the court understands that term, but I am something far more valuable. I am the keeper of your secrets, the guardian of your peace, the one person in this entire kingdom who wants nothing from you except your happiness. The ministers want power, your family wants money, the courtiers want favour, but I, who have already received everything you could possibly give me, want only to see you content, to know that you sleep peacefully, to ensure that you are surrounded by beauty and protected from ugliness. Is this not a greater love than mere physical passion could ever be? This letter, according to Goodman, illustrates one of the most sophisticated aspects of Pompadour's relationship with Louis V. By the early 1750s, their sexual relationship had apparently ended, possibly due to Pompadour's health problems, or Louis's wandering eye, or simple familiarity. But instead of being discarded as most royal mistresses were when the physical relationship ended, Pompadour reinvented herself as Louis's intimate friend and advisor, maintaining her position and influence by making herself emotionally indispensable. The letter explicitly acknowledges the change in their relationship, but frames it as an evolution to something deeper and more meaningful, positioning Pompadour as uniquely selfless in her devotion to Louis's happiness. But Pompadour's letters weren't all strategic positioning and political calculation. According to Goodman, she also wrote letters that were genuinely tender and emotionally vulnerable, revealing the real affection she felt for Louis beneath the political manoeuvring. In a letter from 1755, Pompadour wrote, I am afraid, mon ami. Afraid of growing old, afraid of losing your affection, afraid of the day when you look at me and see only the woman I was rather than the woman I am. I know that I should be stronger, that I should face the future with the confidence that comes from knowing I have your trust and friendship. But late at night, when I am alone, I cannot help but feel the terror of a woman who has built her entire life around one man's love, and who knows that love is the most fragile foundation imaginable. Forgive me this weakness. By morning, I will be strong again, the woman you need me to be. But tonight, I am simply a woman who loves you, and who is afraid of losing you. This letter, according to Goodman, reveals the emotional reality beneath Pompadour's carefully constructed public persona. In public, she was confident, powerful, the woman who shaped French art and culture and diplomacy. But in this private letter, she admits to fear and vulnerability, to the terror of depending entirely on one man's continued favour, to the aging woman's fear of being replaced by younger beauty. According to Goodman, this vulnerability makes Pompadour's letters even more remarkable because they show a woman who understood both the necessity of appearing strong and the occasional need to reveal vulnerability to maintain emotional intimacy. Now let me tell you about a very different kind of royal mistress and a very different kind of love letter. Meet Nell Gwynn, born around 1650 in London, who rose from selling oranges in a theatre to becoming one of the most beloved mistresses of King Charles II of England, known not for political sophistication, like Pompadour, but for wit, warmth and remarkable honesty. According to research by Professor John Harold Wilson from Ohio State University, whose work on Restoration England examines Charles II's mistresses, Nell Gwynn was unusual among royal mistresses because she never pretended to be anything other than what she was, a former actress and orange seller who happened to catch a king's eye and who retained her working-class directness and humour even when living in royal apartments and bearing the king's children. Nell's letters to Charles II, preserved in the British Library and analysed by Wilson, are remarkable for their complete lack of courtly formality and political pretension. Where Pompadour's letters carefully balanced affection with political positioning, Nell's letters are refreshingly straightforward, often funny and sometimes shockingly blunt about money and practical matters. In one letter from 1678, Nell wrote to Charles, "My dearest Charles, I am at present in a very uncomfortable state, having no money and being pursued by creditors who care not at all that I am the mother of your son. The butcher will not give me more meat on credit. The landlord threatens to turn me out of the house you gave me, and I have had to pawn my best gowns to feed the servants. I know you are busy with matters of state and wars and parliaments, but could you please send me some money? I do not ask for jewels or palaces, just enough to pay my debts and feed your child. If you cannot send money, perhaps you could send the Duke of Buckingham to explain to my creditors that it is not wise to harass the king's mistress. I remain, as always, your loving Nell, who would love you even more if you would pay her bills." This letter, according to Wilson, perfectly captures Nell's personality and her relationship with Charles, affectionate and loyal but entirely practical about the economic realities of being a royal mistress. Unlike aristocratic mistresses who brought their own fortunes to the relationship or who could rely on family support, Nell depended entirely on Charles's generosity for survival. And when that generosity failed to arrive promptly, she had no compunction about reminding him of his obligations in the most direct terms possible. The humour in the letter, the suggestion that Buckingham could intimidate her creditors, shows Nell's wit, but beneath the humour is genuine financial desperation. Another letter from Nell, written around 1680 when she was ill, reveals a more tender and vulnerable side while still retaining her characteristic directness. According to Wilson, she wrote, "My dear Charles, I am not well, and the doctors tell me I must rest and take expensive medicines, which of course I cannot afford because you have not sent me my allowance in 3 months. But I do not write to complain about money, though I shall mention it briefly again in case you have forgotten. I write because I am afraid, and when I am afraid the only thing that comforts me is thinking of you. Not you the king, but you the man who used to laugh at my jokes and who made me feel like I was the cleverest woman in England. Even though we both know I can barely write and have never read a book all the way through, if I die, which the doctors say I might, though they always say that to get more money. I want you to know that loving you was the best thing I ever did. Better than acting. Better than anything. Please take care of our son, and please, if you have any affection for me at all, pay my debts so that I do not die in disgrace. Your Nell. This letter, according to Wilson, shows a different Nell from the witty, irreverent woman of her earlier correspondence. Illness and fear of death have made her more serious and more emotionally open, and the letter reveals genuine love beneath the practical requests for money. The phrase, "not you the king, but you the man," suggests that Nell loved Charles as a person rather than being dazzled by his royal status, and the admission that she can barely write and have never read a book all the way through shows touching honesty about her lack of education. According to Wilson, Charles did pay Nell's debts and provided for her until her death in 1687, suggesting that her letters and her genuine affection had earned his loyalty, even as other mistresses came and went. Let me tell you about Barbara Villiers, Countess of Castlemaine, and later Duchess of Cleveland, who was Charles II's most powerful and most demanding mistress before Nell Gwynn, and whose letters reveal a personality completely different from either Pompadour's subtle sophistication or Nell's earthy warmth. According to research by Professor Sonia Wynne from Oxford University, whose work on restoration court culture examines Charles II's relationships, Barbara Villiers was ambitious, volatile, extravagant, and utterly unafraid to make demands of the king, writing letters that ranged from passionate to furious to coldly calculating, depending on what she wanted at any given moment. Barbara's letters to Charles, preserved in various archives and analysed by Wynne, reveal a woman who understood her power over the king and who used that power without hesitation or apology. In a letter from 1662, early in their relationship when Barbara was at the height of her beauty and influence, she wrote, "My lord, I am told that you were seen last night at the theatre paying attention to that orange girl, the one they call Nell. I write to remind you that I am not a woman to be trifled with or replaced by common actresses. I have given you my love, my body, and my reputation. I have endured the Queen's hatred and the court's contempt to be with you. And now you repay my devotion by flirting with theatre wenches. If you wish to continue enjoying my favour, you will send me the diamond necklace I admired last week, and you will never speak to that orange girl again. If you prefer her company to mine, then by all means pursue her. But do not expect me to sit quietly while you humiliate me. I will make such a scandal that all England will know how you have treated me." This letter, according to Wynne, perfectly illustrates Barbara's temperament and her approach to the relationship. She makes no pretense of sweet submission or patient acceptance. Instead, she openly threatens Charles with scandal if he doesn't meet her demands, confident that her hold over him is strong enough that she can make such threats without being discarded. The demand for a diamond necklace as compensation for Charles's attention to Nell shows Barbara's materialistic nature and her skill at turning every situation to her financial advantage. According to Wynne, Barbara extracted enormous sums from Charles over the years of their relationship, accumulating a fortune in jewels, properties, and pensions that made her one of the wealthiest women in England. But Barbara's letters weren't all demands and threats. According to Wynne, she also wrote letters of genuine passion and possessiveness that reveal real feeling beneath the grasping exterior. In a letter from 1663, Barbara wrote, "I cannot sleep for thinking of you. I cannot eat. I cannot concentrate on anything except the memory of your hands on my body and your mouth on mine. The hours when we are apart feel like days, and the minutes when we are together pass like seconds. I am consumed by you, possessed by you, driven mad by my need for you. The court thinks I stay with you for money and titles, but they are fools. I would love you if you were a common soldier with nothing to your name. I would follow you into exile and poverty if that was where you had to go. You are mine, completely mine, and I will destroy any woman who tries to take you from me. Come to me tonight, or I swear I will come to you. Propriety be damned." This letter, according to Wynne, reveals the passionate and possessive nature of Barbara's love for Charles. The language is intense, almost violent in its emotionality, and the threat at the end that she will come to Charles publicly if he doesn't come to her privately shows her willingness to create scandal when her desires weren't met. According to Wynne, Barbara and Charles had a tumultuous relationship marked by passionate reconciliations and furious quarrels, and Barbara's letters reflect these extremes, swinging from threats to declarations of consuming passion, sometimes within the same piece of correspondence. Now let me tell you about Diane de Poitiers, who was the mistress of King Henry II of France from 1538 until his death in 1559. And whose letters reveal a very different dynamic from the relationships we've explored so far, because Diane was nearly 20 years older than Henry, and positioned herself not as a young beauty, but as a wise advisor and almost maternal figure. According to research by Professor Ivan Clueless, whose biography of Diane de Poitiers examines her life and influence, Diane was 40 years old when she became the mistress of Henry, who was only 20, and she maintained her hold over him not through youthful beauty, but through intelligence, political acumen, and the creation of a quasi-maternal relationship that Henry apparently needed after his difficult childhood. Diane's letters to Henry, preserved in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France and analysed by Clueless, show a woman who understood exactly how to appeal to Henry's particular emotional needs. In a letter from 1547, shortly after Henry became king, Diane wrote, "My dear Henry, my king, my son in all but blood, I watched you grow from a frightened boy returned from Spanish captivity into the magnificent king you are today, and my pride in you is boundless. The court may whisper about the nature of our relationship, may say that it is unseemly for a woman of my age to be the companion of a king so much younger, but they do not understand what we have built together. I am not your plaything or your ornament. I am your guide, your teacher, your most devoted servant, and your most honest adviser. When the flatterers at court tell you only what you wish to hear, I will tell you the truth. When the sycophants praise your every decision, I will point out your errors. When the world treats you as a king, I will remember that you are also a man who needs comfort, guidance, and unconditional love. This is my gift to you, and it is worth more than any young beauty could offer." This letter, according to Clueless, perfectly captures Diane's strategy for maintaining her position with a king who was young enough to be her son. She explicitly addresses the age difference and the court gossip about it, but reframes it as an advantage rather than a liability, by positioning herself as Henry's guide and teacher, as a maternal figure who offers wisdom and honesty rather than just physical beauty. Diane created a role for herself that younger women couldn't fill. According to Clueless, Henry had spent years of his childhood as a hostage in Spain, separated from his mother and traumatized by the experience, and Diane seems to have understood that he needed maternal affection and guidance as much as or more than he needed romantic love. Another letter from Diane, written in 1552 when Henry was considering going to war, reveals how she combined maternal concern with political advice. According to Clueless, she wrote, "My beloved Henry, I hear that you are determined to lead your armies personally into battle, and while I admire your courage and your commitment to France, I must beg you to reconsider. Not because I fear for my own position if you should fall, for I am old enough to accept whatever fate God has planned for me, but because France cannot afford to lose you. You are not just a king, you are a husband and a father, and your children need you. Your wife needs you, and yes, I need you, though I know I have no right to make such claims. But beyond all personal considerations, your kingdom needs you alive and well, not martyred on some foreign battlefield. There are generals who can lead your armies. There is only one king of France, and that king is you. Please, Monsieur, send your best commanders to war, but stay here where you are safe and where you can rule the kingdom that depends on you. This I ask not as your mistress, not as your advisor, but as a woman who has loved you since you were a child and who cannot bear the thought of losing you. This letter, according to Clueless, shows Diane at her most effective, blending maternal concern with pragmatic political advice and personal pleading. She appeals to Henry's sense of duty to his family and kingdom, positions herself as selflessly concerned for his welfare rather than her own, and uses language that would be appropriate from a mother advising a son while also acknowledging their more complex relationship. According to Clueless, Henry did not go to war on that occasion, suggesting that Diane's advice carried significant weight with him. Let me tell you about a scandalous aspect of royal mistress letters that we haven't explored yet. The explicitly sexual content that some mistresses included in their correspondence. Content so graphic that when these letters were discovered centuries later, scholars debated whether they could be published or should remain locked away. According to research by Professor Linda Pollock from Tulane University, whose work on early modern sexuality examines intimate correspondence, royal mistresses' letters often contained very explicit descriptions of sexual acts and desires, serving both to keep kings sexually interested when they were apart and to remind kings of the physical pleasures that mistresses provided. One of the most famous examples comes from Louise de la Vallière, who was Louis XIV's trince before Madame de Montespan, and whose letters to Louis contained passages so explicit that, according to Pollock, they were kept locked in the French royal archives for over 2 centuries and were only published in heavily censored form in the 20th century. In a letter from 1667, which I will quote in sanitized form, Louise wrote, "My king, my love, my everything, I count the hours until I can be in your arms again, until I can feel your body against mine, your hands exploring me in ways that no language can adequately describe. When we are apart, I relive every moment of our last encounter, remembering every touch, every kiss, every whispered word of love. The nights are endless without you, and I find myself aching for you in ways that are both sweet and torturous. Come to me soon, my love, for I cannot endure much more of this separation. Your Louise, who belongs to you completely, body and soul." Even in this censored version, according to Pollock, you can sense the explicitly sexual nature of Louise's original letter. The uncensored version, according to Pollock, contained very detailed descriptions of specific sexual acts and physical sensations, written in language that was designed to arouse Louis and to remind him of the physical pleasures of their relationship. According to Pollock, this kind of explicit sexual content was common in royal mistresses' letters because mistresses understood that maintaining a king's sexual interest was crucial to maintaining their position and power, and letters served as a way to keep that sexual connection alive during periods of separation. Now, let me tell you about Emma Hamilton, who was the mistress of Lord Horatio Nelson, Britain's greatest naval hero, and whose letters reveal a relationship that was genuinely romantic and emotionally intense, despite the scandal it created, and despite the fact that both were married to other people. According to research by Professor Flora Fraser, whose biography of Emma Hamilton examines her life and relationship with Nelson, Emma was unusual among royal and aristocratic mistresses, because her relationship with Nelson was not primarily about money or power, but about genuine mutual love and respect. Though the relationship still destroyed Emma's reputation and left her destitute after Nelson's death, Emma's letters to Nelson, particularly those written while he was at sea during the Napoleonic Wars, are preserved in various British archives and are remarkable for their emotional intensity and political engagement. In a letter from 1803, Emma wrote, "My own beloved Nelson, every day that you are away from me is a day of anxiety and terror. I read the newspapers obsessively for news of naval engagements, fearing always that I will read of your death or injury. The thought of losing you is so unbearable that sometimes I cannot breathe for the weight of it on my chest. But I know that you are doing what you must do, serving England and defending our nation against tyranny, and I am so proud of you that I could burst. When people criticize our relationship, when they call me your whore and condemn our love as immoral, I want to shout at them that you are the greatest man England has ever produced, that you are risking your life every day for people who are not worthy of you, and that I love you with every fibre of my being. Come home to me safely, my love. Come home so that I can hold you and tell you in person how much I adore you. This letter, according to Fraser, shows Emma's characteristic combination of passionate personal feeling and political awareness. She expresses her fear for Nelson's safety and her deep love for him, but she also acknowledges his duty to England and expresses pride in his service, despite the personal cost to her. The defiant tone when discussing the criticism of their relationship shows Emma's refusal to be ashamed of loving Nelson, despite the scandal, and despite the fact that both were married to others. According to Fraser, Emma and Nelson's letters to each other reveal one of the great love stories of history, a relationship based on genuine mutual affection and respect despite its irregular nature. Another letter from Emma, written just before the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, shows her prescient fear that Nelson might not return from this campaign. According to Fraser, Emma wrote, "My dearest, dearest love, I have the most terrible premonition that this battle will be your last, that God is calling you home, and that I will never see you again in this life. I pray that I am wrong, that my fears are merely the anxieties of a woman who loves too deeply and worries too much. But if I am right, if you do not return to me, I want you to know that loving you was the greatest honour and joy of my life. You made me feel worthy of love even when the whole world despised me. You saw me not as a fallen woman or a discredited adventuress, but as a person of value and intelligence. You gave me respect when I had lost all respectability, and for that I will be eternally grateful. Go into battle knowing that you are loved completely, absolutely, forever. And if God should take you from me, know that I will love you until my dying breath and beyond, into whatever eternity awaits us. Your Emma, always and forever." This letter, according to Fraser, was one of the last Emma wrote to Nelson before he was killed at Trafalgar on the 21st of October, 1805. The prescient fear that he would not return proved tragically accurate, and according to Fraser, Emma never recovered from Nelson's death, spending her remaining years in increasing poverty and despair, dying destitute in Calais in 1815. The love expressed in her letters to Nelson was genuine and deep, but it could not protect her from the consequences of being a fallen woman in a society that offered no forgiveness and no support to women who transgressed sexual boundaries. Now, let me tell you about a very different kind of scandal in royal mistress letters, coded political messages, and espionage hidden within romantic correspondence. According to research by Professor Janet Hartley from the London School of Economics, whose work on Russian imperial history examines court intrigue, some royal mistresses served as unofficial spies and diplomatic backchannels, using their love letters to pass information and influence policy in ways that bypassed official governmental channels. One of the most intriguing examples comes from Countess Katarzyna Branicka, who was the mistress of Tsar Alexander I of Russia in the early 19th century, and whose letters contained coded references to Polish independence movements and European diplomatic negotiations. In a letter from 1815 preserved in Russian state archives and analysed by Hartley, Katarzyna wrote what appeared to be a conventional love letter, but which contained multiple coded phrases referring to Polish political matters. According to Hartley's decoding, Katarzyna wrote, "My beloved Sasha, the roses in the garden are blooming magnificently this year, particularly the white ones which have always been my favourites. I walked among them this morning, counting 17 particularly beautiful blooms, and thinking of you with every step. The gardener tells me that the soil here is particularly fertile for these delicate flowers, and that with proper care they might flourish even more abundantly next spring. I dream of showing you the garden in its full glory, of walking with you among the roses, and perhaps picking a few to bring indoors where they can be appreciated properly. Your loving Katarzyna." This seemingly innocent letter, according to Hartley, actually contained coded information about Polish political groups. The white roses referred to Polish independence activists. The 17 referenced a specific number of political prisoners, and the suggestion about the flowers flourishing next spring was a reference to planned uprisings, timed for spring 1816. According to Hartley, Alexander I would have understood these codes, and his response to Katarzyna's letter would have indicated his position on Polish political questions in ways that couldn't be traced through official diplomatic channels. This kind of coded correspondence was risky for mistresses, making them participants in political conspiracies that could lead to their ruin if discovered. But it also gave them genuine political power beyond mere sexual influence. Let me tell you now about the ultimate cost of being a royal mistress, and how that cost is revealed in the desperate later letters that many mistresses wrote when they had fallen from favour or after their royal lovers died. According to research by Professor Amanda Foreman from Cambridge University, whose work on aristocratic women examines the fate of discarded mistresses, the transition from powerful royal favourite to abandoned woman was often swift and brutal, and the letters that former mistresses wrote begging for support and financial assistance are among the most heartbreaking in history. Agnes Sorel, who was the mistress of King Charles VII of France in the 1440s, and who was rumoured to have been poisoned by the king's son in 1450, wrote numerous letters in her final months that reveal her fear and vulnerability. In a letter from late 1449, preserved in French archives and analysed by Foreman, Agnes wrote to Charles, "My lord and love, I am frightened, more frightened than I have ever been in my life. There are those at court who hate me for the influence I have with you, who whisper that I am a witch who has bewitched you, who plot my destruction. I hear rumours that I will be poisoned, that I will be accused of treason, that I will be destroyed to weaken your resolve and your power. I beg you, protect me. I have given you everything, my body, my reputation, my entire life. I have borne you 4 children. I have advised you wisely and helped you regain your kingdom from the English. Do not abandon me now when I need your protection most. I am terrified that I will not live to see another spring, that those who hate me will succeed in destroying me. Please, my love, keep me safe." This letter, according to Foreman, was written less than a year before Agnes died suddenly at age 28, possibly poisoned, though the evidence is not conclusive. Whether or not her fears were justified, the letter reveals the vulnerability of royal mistresses who had made powerful enemies at court and who depended entirely on their lovers' protection for survival. According to Foreman, when that protection failed or when the king died, mistresses often faced ruin, poverty, exile, or worse. The pattern of desperate letters from discarded or widowed mistresses continues through history. Madame du Barry, who was Louis XII's last official mistress, wrote increasingly desperate letters during the French Revolution, as she realised that her association with the old regime had made her a target for revolutionary justice. In a letter from 1793, shortly before her arrest, du Barry wrote to a friend, "They are coming for me. I know they are coming. Everyone associated with the king is being arrested, tried, and executed, and I am the most visible symbol of royal corruption in the minds of the revolutionaries. I, who never harmed anyone, who spent the king's money on beautiful things that gave employment to artists and craftsmen, who tried only to bring joy and beauty into the world. I am to be punished for having loved a king and been loved by him in return. I am terrified. I do not want to die. I am not brave like the aristocrats who go to the guillotine with dignity. I will beg and plead and humiliate myself to stay alive. Is this wrong? Should I be ashamed of wanting to live? I cannot pretend to courage I do not feel. If they execute me, I will die screaming, and perhaps that is fitting, for my entire life has been a scream of want and fear disguised as beauty and pleasure." Du Barry was arrested in September 1793 and executed by guillotine on the 8th of December 1793 at age 50. According to contemporary accounts cited by Foreman, she did indeed scream and beg for mercy on the scaffold, her terror a stark contrast to the calm dignity with which many aristocrats faced death during the Reign of Terror. Her final letter's prediction of her own behaviour proved accurate, and according to Foreman, it reveals the truth that Du Barry, for all her years as a powerful royal mistress, had never developed the kind of philosophical courage or political conviction that might have made death easier to face. Now let me tell you about Madame de Montespan, who succeeded Louise de la Vallière as Louis IV's official mistress, and who wrote some of the most manipulative and strategically brilliant letters in the entire history of royal mistresses. Born Franoise Athenaise de Rochechart de Mortemart in 1640, Montespan came from one of France's oldest noble families and brought to her relationship with Louis IV an aristocratic pride and political cunning that made her both fascinating and dangerous. According to research by Professor Lisa Hilton from Oxford University, whose work on French royal mistresses examines Montespan's influence, she dominated Louis XIV's affections from 1667 to 1679, bore him 7 children, and wielded such power that ambassadors sought her favour and ministers trembled at her displeasure. Montespan's letters to Louis XIV, preserved in the Archives Nationales and analysed by Professor Hilton, reveal a woman who understood power in all its dimensions: sexual, political, financial, and psychological. In a letter from 1670, during the height of her influence, Montespan wrote to Louis, "My magnificent king, my son, my everything, I write to you from Clagny, where I await your visit with an impatience that borders on madness. The chateau you are building for me rises day by day, each stone a testament to your love, each room a promise of the pleasures we will share within its walls. But buildings, however magnificent, are cold comfort when you are not here. I need you, not as a subject needs her king, but as a woman needs the man who has awakened every desire she never knew she possessed. Come to me tonight. Come and let me show you exactly what your generosity has purchased, not in terms of chateau and jewels, though I treasure those as tokens of your affection, but in terms of pleasures that only I can provide, pleasures that will make you forget every other woman who has ever touched you or ever will." This letter, according to Professor Hilton, demonstrates Montespan's mastery of the art of being a royal mistress. She acknowledges Louise's gifts, the toe at Clagny that was costing a fortune to build, but immediately frames them not as payment but as expressions of love. She positions herself not as bought but as the buyer, suggesting that Louise's generosity has purchased access to pleasures she provides. And she makes an explicit claim to sexual superiority over all other women, past and future, a bold assertion that worked, because Montespan was, by all contemporary accounts, a woman of extraordinary sensuality and erotic skill. But Montespan's letters weren't always seductive. According to Professor Hilton, she also wrote letters of furious jealousy when she felt her position threatened, particularly as she aged and Louis began to turn his attention to younger women. In a letter from 1678, when Montespan was 38, and Louis was beginning his relationship with Madame de Maintenon, who would eventually become his secret wife, Montespan wrote, "So it has come to this. After everything I have sacrificed for you, after bearing your children in pain and shame, after enduring the contempt of your court and the hatred of your wife, after giving you the best years of my life and my beauty, you reward me by chasing after that dried up governess, that sanctimonious widow who wouldn't know passion if it struck her like lightning. Do you really believe she can satisfy you the way I have? Do you think her prim prayers and her tedious piety can replace what we have shared? You are a fool if you think so, and you will realize your mistake when you lie in her cold bed and remember the fires we kindled together. But by then it may be too late, for I am not a woman who accepts humiliation quietly. If you cast me aside for that creature, you will discover exactly what it means to earn the enmity of a woman of my family and my temperament. This letter, according to Professor Hilton, reveals Montespan at her most vulnerable and most dangerous. She appeals to Louise's memory of their shared passion, insults her rival Madame de Maintenon in the crudest terms, and threatens consequences if Louis abandons her. The reference to a woman of my family and my temperament was not an idle threat. Montespan came from the Mortemart family, known for their pride, their wit, and their capacity for vengeance. According to Professor Hilton, Louis did gradually distance himself from Montespan in the late 1670s and early 1680s, but he never completely cast her aside, continuing to provide for her and their children, and maintaining at least the appearance of friendship. Possibly because he genuinely cared for her, but also possibly because he feared what she might do if truly desperate. Let me tell you about the darkest aspect of Montespan's story, because it involves letters that were never meant to be discovered, and that revealed a scandal so shocking it threatened to destroy her completely. In 1679, Paris was convulsed by the affair des Poisons, a scandal involving multiple aristocrats who were accused of buying poisons and participating in black masses to kill their enemies or maintain the love of their partners. According to research by Professor Anne Somerset from Cambridge University, whose work on the affair of the poisons examines the scandal, Montespan was implicated when letters between her and a notorious fortune teller and alleged poisoner named Lavoisin were discovered. The letters, according to Professor Somerset, suggested that Montespan had purchased love potions and aphrodisiacs to maintain Louis's sexual interest, and there were even more disturbing allegations that she had participated in black masses where prayers were said over her naked body and where infants might have been sacrificed. The evidence was murky and possibly fabricated or exaggerated by Montespan's enemies, but according to Professor Somerset, Louis XIV saw at least some of the letters and testimony. In one letter that survived in legal records, Montespan allegedly wrote Lavoisin, "The king grows cold toward me. I need something stronger than what you have provided before. I will pay any price, do anything necessary to keep his love. If there are rituals that must be performed, tell me what they are and I will perform them. If there are substances that must be administered, provide them, and I will find ways to give them to him. I cannot lose him. I will not lose him. Do whatever must be done." Whether Montespan actually wrote this letter or whether it was forged by her enemies is still debated by historians, according to Professor Somerset. But the fact that such a letter existed in the legal record of the affair of the poisons, and that Louis XIV saw it or heard testimony about it, changed Montespan's relationship with the king forever. According to Professor Somerset, Louis never formally accused Montespan or allowed her to be arrested, possibly because he couldn't bear to believe the allegations, possibly because he wanted to protect the reputation of his children by her, or possibly because he feared the scandal that would result from publicly acknowledging that his mistress might have been involved in poisoning and black magic. But their intimate relationship ended in the early 1680s, and while Montespan remained at court for many more years, her power was broken. Now let me tell you about royal mistress letters from the medieval period, because the relationships and the letters from that era were different in character from the early modern and modern examples we've been exploring. Let me tell you about Alice Perrers, who was the mistress of King Edward III of England in the 1360s and 1370s, during the final years of Edward's long reign. According to research by Professor W. Mark Ormrod from the University of York, whose work on Edward III examines his later years, Alice Perrers was one of the most controversial figures of 14th century England. A woman of relatively modest origins who became enormously wealthy and politically powerful through her relationship with the aging king, and who was universally hated by contemporaries, who blamed her for Edward's decline and for her own alleged greed and manipulation. Very few letters between Alice and Edward survive, if any were ever written, because literacy among even aristocratic women was less common in the 14th century than it would be in later periods. But according to Professor Ormrod, contemporary chronicles record what were purported to be Alice's words to Edward, and some of these may have been transmitted through oral messages or through letters written by scribes on her behalf. According to one chronicle account analysed by Professor Ormrod, Alice sent a message to Edward when he was ill in 1376. "Shortly before his death, my dearest lord, they are trying to separate us. the bishops and the lords who have always hated me because I am not of their rank, and because you have honoured me above my station. They whisper that I have corrupted you, that I have stolen from you, that I have led you into sin. But you know the truth, my love. You know that I have been faithful to you, that I have comforted you in your old age, when your wife died and your sons were too busy fighting each other to care for their father. You know that every jewel you gave me, every manor you granted me, was a gift freely given, not something I stole or extorted. Do not let them drive me away from you now, when you need me most. Do not die with their lies poisoning your last thoughts of me. This message, according to Professor Ormrod, whether it was actually from Alice or was fabricated by chroniclers who wanted to portray her as a manipulative seductress, captures the precarious position of medieval royal mistresses. Alice had indeed acquired enormous wealth through Edward's grants, including jewels, manors, and the right to collect customs duties, making her one of the richest women in England. But all of this depended entirely on Edward's continued favour and protection, and as Edward lay dying in June 1376, Alice's enemies moved against her. According to chronicles, she was literally pulled away from Edward's deathbed, and after his death she was tried by Parliament, convicted of extortion and theft, and stripped of all her property. She died in obscurity sometime in the 1390s, all her wealth and power gone, a stark example of what happened to royal mistresses when their protectors died. Let me tell you about Jane Shore, mistress of King Edward IV of England in the 1470s, whose story was immortalised in literature and who became a symbol of the beautiful but doomed royal mistress. According to research by Professor Amy Licence from the University of Buckingham, whose work on medieval women examines Jane's life, Jane was the wife of a London merchant when she attracted Edward IV's attention, leaving her husband to become the king's mistress and living openly in royal luxury for several years. Unlike Alice Perrers, Jane Shore was literate and probably did write letters to Edward IV, though none survive. What do survive, according to Professor Licence, are letters that Jane wrote later, after Edward IV's death in 1483, when she found herself at the mercy of Edward's brother Richard III, who became king, and who was determined to destroy everyone associated with Edward IV. In a letter written in 1483, shortly before Richard III forced Jane to do public penance for adultery, Jane wrote to a friend, "I am ruined. The king is dead, and his brother, who now calls himself king, has turned his fury upon me. I am to be paraded through the streets in my shift, carrying a candle, doing penance as a whore, so that all London can see how low I have fallen. All my property is confiscated. All my friends have abandoned me, fearing Richard's wrath if they help me. I, who once lived in palaces, now live in terror, waiting for worse to come. They say Richard wants to charge me with witchcraft, claiming that I helped Edward's wife bewitch the king. The charge is absurd, but truth matters little when a king wants someone destroyed. I do not know how much longer I can endure this. Every day I wake wondering if this will be the day they come to arrest me on some new charge, to take me to the Tower, to end my life as they have ended so many others who stood in Richard's way." This letter, according to Professor Licence, reveals the absolute vulnerability of royal mistresses when their protectors died, and when political circumstances turned against them. Jane Shore did survive Richard III's persecution, performing her public penance and living in poverty for the rest of her life, dying in obscurity in the early 16th century. But her letters and the stories told about her became famous as cautionary tales about the dangers of being a royal mistress, about how quickly power and luxury could turn to shame and destitution. Now let me tell you about royal mistresses in Spain, because the Spanish court had its own traditions and its own scandals involving royal mistresses and their correspondence. Let me tell you about Inés de Castro, who was the mistress of Prince Pedro of Portugal in the 1340s and 1350s, and whose tragic story became one of the great romances of Iberian literature, According to research by Professor Maria del Carmen Vaquero Serrano from the University of Castilla-La Mancha, whose work on medieval Iberian history examines Intiz's life. Intiz was a lady in waiting to Pedro's wife Constanza, and she and Pedro fell deeply in love, conducting their affair while Constanza was still alive and continuing their relationship after Constanza's death, when Pedro refused to marry anyone else despite pressure from his father, King Afonso IV. Inez's letters to Pedro, if they ever existed, do not survive, but Portuguese chronicles record what were purported to be her words to Pedro during their years together. According to Professor Vaquero Serrano's analysis of these chronicle accounts, Inez reportedly wrote or said to Pedro, "My beloved, they are trying to separate us. Your father and his counselors who fear that our love threatens the kingdom. They say that I am a foreign influence, that my family's Spanish connections make me dangerous, that our children have no legitimate claim to anything, and yet you treat them as if they were princes. But you know that I love you not for your rank or your inheritance, but for yourself, for the man you are beneath the title of prince. I would live with you in poverty if necessary. I would follow you into exile if your father demands it. All I ask is that you not send me away, that you not bow to their pressure to marry some foreign princess. You do not love. Let us have our happiness for as long as God grants it to us, and let the future take care of itself." But the future did not take care of itself kindly for Inés de Castro. According to Professor Vaquero Serrano, in January 1355, King Afonso IV, convinced that Inés and her children posed a threat to the succession and to Portuguese independence, sent men to murder Inés at the monastery, where she was living with her and Pedro's children. She was stabbed to death in front of her children, and according to legend, her last words were a message for Pedro, begging him not to seek vengeance and to take care of their children. Pedro, according to the chronicles, was consumed by rage and grief, rebelling against his father, and when he became king in 1357, exhuming Inris's body, dressing it in royal robes, placing a crown on her head, and forcing the entire court to pay homage to her corpse, acknowledging her as his queen even in death. The story of Inés de Castro, according to Professor Vaquero Serrano, became a legendary example of tragic royal love, inspiring countless poems, plays, and operas over the centuries. Whether the words attributed to her in chronicles were actually hers or were literary inventions, they express themes that recur throughout royal mistress letters: the declaration of love that transcends rank and wealth, the defiance of those who would separate the lovers, the assertion that true love is more valuable than political calculation, and the tragic awareness that such love is vulnerable to forces beyond the lover's control. Let me tell you about a very different Spanish royal mistress, Mara Calderón, known as La Calderona, who was the mistress of King Philip IV of Spain in the 1620s and 1630s. According to research by Professor Patrick Williams from the University of Portsmouth, whose work on Philip V examines his reign, La Calderona was an actress, a profession considered scandalous and barely respectable, who caught the king's eye when he saw her perform, and who became his mistress, bearing him a son, Juan Gosi of Austria, who would later become a significant political and military figure in 17th century Spain. La Calderona's letters to Philip IV, some of which survive in Spanish archives and are analysed by Professor Williams, reveal a woman who was acutely aware of her low social status and who constantly struggled to secure her position and provide for her son. In a letter from 1630, La Calderona wrote to Philip, "Your Majesty, I write to beg you once again to provide for our son as you have promised. The boy is now 4 years old, and he needs proper education, proper care, proper recognition of his parentage. I know that I am not a noble woman, that my profession as an actress makes me scandalous in the eyes of your court, that you can never acknowledge me publicly as you might acknowledge a mistress of better birth. But our son is your son. Royal blood flows in his veins, and he deserves better than to be raised in poverty and obscurity. I ask nothing for myself. My career on the stage provides enough for my own needs. But for him, for your son, I beg you to show the generosity that befits a king and a father." This letter, according to Professor Williams, illustrates the particular difficulties faced by royal mistresses of low social status. Unlike aristocratic mistresses who had their own family resources and social position to fall back on, women like La Calderona depended entirely on the king's generosity, and their children faced enormous obstacles to gaining any kind of recognition or support. Philip IV did eventually provide for Juan José, taking him from his mother, placing him in a noble household to be raised, and eventually acknowledging him as a royal bastard, though he never gave Juan José any rights to the succession. La Calderona, according to Professor Williams, eventually retired from the stage and entered a convent, where she lived until her death in 1677, having been separated from her son when he was still a child. Her letters to Philip showing both her love for her son and her powerlessness to keep him or protect him in any way, except by begging the king's favour. Now, let me tell you about letters that royal mistresses wrote about pregnancy and children, because this was one of the most fraught and complicated aspects of being a royal mistress. Pregnancy could secure a mistress's position by giving the king a child he valued, but it could also be dangerous, both physically and politically, and children born to royal mistresses occupied an ambiguous and often painful position, acknowledged as the king's offspring but unable to inherit, given titles and support, but always reminded of their illegitimate status. Let me tell you about Jeanne de Valois Saint-Rémy, Countess de la Motte, who was not exactly a royal mistress, but who was centrally involved in the scandalous affair of the diamond necklace in 1780s France, and whose letters reveal the desperation of women on the margins of royal circles, trying to use any connection, real or fabricated, to improve their positions. According to research by Professor Sarah Mazza from Northwestern University, whose work on the diamond necklace affair examines the scandal, the Countess de la Motte claimed descent from an illegitimate line of the French royal family, and used this claim, along with forged letters purporting to be from Queen Marie Antoinette, to perpetrate an elaborate fraud involving an enormously expensive diamond necklace. The letters that the Countess de la Motte forged, according to Professor Mazza, were remarkably skillful imitations of intimate royal correspondence, suggesting that she had studied real royal letters or at least understood the conventions of such correspondence. In one forged letter attributed to Marie Antoinette and analysed by Professor Mazza, the Countess wrote, "My dear friend, I write to you in confidence because I cannot turn to anyone else in this matter. There is a diamond necklace, the most magnificent piece of jewellery imaginable, and I desire it more than I have desired anything in years, but the king refuses to purchase it for me, claiming that the price is too high, and that France's finances cannot bear such an expense. He is probably right, but I do not care. I want that necklace. I need you to help me acquire it secretly, through means that will not involve the king or the royal treasury. Can you arrange to purchase it on my behalf? I will find ways to repay you, though it may take time. No one must know of this transaction. The king would be furious if he discovered I was defying his wishes, and the court would condemn me for extravagance. But I trust you to keep my secret and to help me in this matter." This letter, of course, was a complete fabrication, according to Professor Mazza. Marie Antoinette never wrote it and knew nothing about the necklace scheme, but the letter was convincing enough to fool the Cardinal de Rohan, who arranged to purchase the necklace believing he was acting on the Queen's behalf, and hoping to win her favour. When the scheme was discovered, according to Professor Mazza, the scandal destroyed reputations and contributed to the growing hatred of Marie Antoinette that would eventually lead to her execution during the French Revolution. The Countess de la Motte was arrested, tried, and sentenced to be whipped, branded, and imprisoned, though she later escaped to England. Her forged letters, according to Professor Mazza, are interesting not because they were genuine royal mistress letters, but because they show what people believed such letters looked like: intimate, secretive, mixing personal desire with requests for help, assuming a level of trust and complicity that characterized the correspondence between royal lovers. Let me tell you about Madame de Maintenon, who was Louis XIV's secret second wife, and who occupies an unusual position in the history of royal mistresses because she successfully transformed herself from mistress to wife, albeit a wife whose marriage was never publicly acknowledged. Born Franois d'Aubin in 1635, she first married the poet Paul Scarron. Then, after his death, became governess to Louis XIV's children by Madame de Montespan. According to research by Professor Ruth Kleinman from Brooklyn College, whose biography of Madame de Maintenon examines her life, Maintenon attracted Louis's attention initially through her discretion, her piety, and her intelligence, qualities very different from the overt sexuality and political manipulation of Montespan. Maintenon's letters to Louis XIV, written during the 1680s when she was transitioning from governess to mistress to secret wife, reveal a woman using a completely different strategy from other royal mistresses. Where Montespan emphasized passion and sexuality, where Pompadour emphasized political utility and emotional support, Maintenon emphasized religion, morality, and salvation. According to Professor Kleinman's analysis of letters preserved in the Archives Nationales, Maintenon wrote to Louis, "Sire, I write to you not as a woman seeking your favour, but as a Christian concerned for your immortal soul. You have lived a life of great sin, taking women who are not your wife, fathering children outside of holy matrimony, indulging in pleasures that God condemns. I do not judge you harshly, for I know that you are a man subject to temptations, and that your position has made it easy for women to offer themselves to you. But I fear for you. I fear that when you stand before God's judgment, all your earthly glory will count for nothing if your soul is stained with unrepented sin. Let me help you find the path to salvation. Let me guide you toward a life that honors God rather than offends him. It is not too late to change, not too late to seek forgiveness, not too late to live as a Christian king should live." This letter, according to Professor Kleinman, reveals Maintenon's brilliant strategy. Instead of competing with other women on the basis of beauty or passion, she positioned herself as Louis's spiritual advisor and conscience, offering him something he couldn't get from anyone else: absolution and the hope of salvation. Louis XIV, who was aging and increasingly worried about his legacy and his afterlife, found Maintenon's approach compelling. According to Professor Kleinman, he gradually distanced himself from other mistresses, adopted a more pious lifestyle, and eventually married Maintenon secretly, probably in October 1683, though the marriage was never publicly announced, and Maintenon never became queen in title. But Maintenon's letters weren't all about religion and salvation. According to Professor Kleinman, she also wrote letters that reveal genuine affection for Louis, and that show her loneliness in her unique position as secret wife. In a letter from the 1690s, Maintenon wrote to Louis, "My dear husband, for that is what you are even though the world does not know it. I find myself feeling lonely tonight, despite being surrounded by courtiers and servants. The loneliness comes from knowing that I can never be acknowledged as your wife, that I must always maintain the fiction of being merely your friend and advisor, that our marriage exists only in secret and in the eyes of God. I do not complain, for I knew what I was accepting when we wed, and I believe that our private union, blessed by God, is worth more than any public ceremony could be. But sometimes I wish I could simply say to the world, I am his wife, he is my husband, and what we have together is holy and legitimate, even if it is secret. Forgive these weak thoughts, my love. I will be strong again by morning. But tonight, I needed to tell you that I sometimes feel the burden of our secret, and that I carry it willingly only because I love you." This letter, according to Professor Kleinman, reveals the emotional cost of Maintenon's position. She had achieved what no other royal mistress achieved, a legitimate marriage to the king, but the secrecy meant that she never received the public recognition and status that should have come with being queen. She was the king's wife, but had to pretend to be merely his companion. She influenced policy and advised the king on matters of state and religion, but she could never claim credit or acknowledgement for her role. According to Professor Kleinman, Maintenon lived this double life for over 30 years, until Louis XIV's death in 1715, after which she retired to a school for girls that she had founded and lived there until her own death in 1719. Now let me tell you about the actual physical nature of love letters between royal mistresses and kings, because understanding how these letters were written, sent, delivered, and preserved helps us understand both their intimacy and their danger. According to research by Professor James Daybell from the University of Plymouth, whose work on early modern correspondence examines letter writing practices, letters in the early modern period were handwritten on paper or parchment, sealed with wax impressed with a signet ring or seal to ensure privacy, and delivered by trusted servants or messengers who might travel for days to carry a single letter between separated lovers. The physical act of writing a love letter, according to Professor Daybell, was significant in itself. Paper was expensive, especially fine paper of the quality that aristocratic lovers would use. Ink had to be prepared, quills had to be cut and sharpened. The handwriting itself conveyed meaning an educated aristocratic hand versus a less polished script. The size and flourish of letters, the evidence of haste or careful composition, and because letters were handwritten, they carried the physical trace of the writer's hand, making them intimate objects in a way that typed or printed text could never be. Let me tell you about how royal mistresses sometimes included locks of hair, pressed flowers or other tokens in their letters to kings, creating what were essentially love objects, as well as written communications. According to Professor Daybell, one letter from an unidentified mistress to a French king in the 17th century, preserved in the Bibliothèque Nationale, contains a lock of dark hair tied with a silk ribbon and a note reading, "This is from my head, cut this morning when I woke thinking of you and wishing you were beside me. Keep it with you, close to your heart, and know that every hair on my head belongs to you as completely as my heart and my body do." The inclusion of the lock of hair, according to Professor Daybell, transformed the letter from mere communication into a love token, a physical piece of the mistress herself that the king could keep with him. This practice of including tokens in love letters was common among royal and aristocratic lovers, creating a culture of romantic correspondence that was both literary and material, both verbal and physical. But the physical nature of letters also made them dangerous. According to Professor Daybell, letters could be intercepted, stolen, or discovered, and the evidence they provided of illicit relationships could be used to destroy reputations, blackmail lovers, or create political scandals. Royal mistresses and kings had to take precautions to protect their correspondence. Some used codes, as we saw with Countess Katarzyna Branicka. Some used trusted servants as messengers who could be counted on to deliver letters without reading them or sharing their contents. Some destroyed letters after reading them, which is why so few survive, despite the fact that thousands must have been written. Let me tell you about Catherine Sedley, Countess of Dorchester, who was the mistress of King James II of England in the 1680s, and whose letters reveal both the wit and the vulnerability of a woman who knew she was not beautiful, but who had managed to attract a king anyway. According to research by Professor John Miller from Queen Mary University of London, whose work on James II's reign, Catherine Sedley was famously plain, a fact that she acknowledged in her letters with self-deprecating humour. In one letter to James from 1686, Catherine wrote, "Your Majesty, I am told that people at court cannot understand why you keep me as your mistress when I am so notably ugly, and there are beautiful women everywhere who would gladly take my place. I confess I share their confusion. When I look in the mirror, I see nothing that should attract a king. But when I am with you, you make me feel as though I am the most beautiful woman in the world, and that is a gift worth more than actual beauty could ever be. Perhaps you love me for my wit, or for my honesty, or simply because I make you laugh when you are burdened by the weight of kingship. Whatever the reason, I am grateful for it. and I will love you faithfully, even though I know that faithfulness in Mistresses is probably neither expected nor particularly valued. This letter, according to Professor Miller, reveals Catherine Sedley's intelligence and self-awareness. She acknowledges openly that she is not beautiful. She speculates frankly about why James might value her anyway, and she makes a joke about mistress ethics that shows both humour and a clear-eyed understanding of her position. According to Professor Miller, James II did value Catherine for her intelligence and wit, keeping her as his mistress despite pressure from his wife and from Catholic advisors who disapproved of the relationship. Catherine survived James's reign and his deposition in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, living on in England while James went into exile, and receiving a pension that allowed her to live comfortably until her death in 1717. Now let me tell you about letters that were destroyed, because for every letter that survives in archives, dozens or hundreds or thousands were burned, torn up, or otherwise destroyed to protect reputations and prevent scandals. According to research by Professor Constance Jordan from Claremont Graduate University, whose work on early modern women examined their private writings, the decision to preserve or destroy letters was often made by the recipients or by executors going through papers after someone's death, and the decision usually reflected concerns about scandal and reputation rather than about historical preservation. Let me tell you about Walburga Eringard von Meisenberg, Countess of Wartenberg, who was the mistress of Frederick I of Prussia in the early 18th century, and who wielded enormous political influence at the Prussian court. According to research by Professor Karen Friedrich from the University of Aberdeen, whose work on Prussian history examines the reign of Frederick I, Walburga was one of the most powerful women in early 18th century Prussia, controlling access to the king, influencing appointments, and essentially running much of the government's day-to-day operations. She must have written countless letters to Frederick I, letters that would reveal the inner workings of the Prussian court and the relationship between a king and the mistress, who governed in all but name. But according to Professor Friedrich, almost none of Walburga's letters to Frederick I survive. When Frederick I died in 1713, his son Frederick William I, who hated Walburga and everything she represented, came to power and moved quickly to destroy her influence. According to Professor Friedrich, Frederick William I ordered that Walburga's papers be seized, and it is likely that any letters between her and Frederick I were deliberately destroyed to erase the evidence of her power and to prevent her from using correspondence as leverage. Walburga was exiled from court, stripped of her property, and died in obscurity in 1730, her voice silenced and her letters burned. The destruction of such letters, according to Professor Friedrich, represents an enormous loss for historians trying to understand both the personal and political dimensions of royal courts. We know Walburga was powerful, we know she influenced policy, but we cannot read her own words explaining her strategies, expressing her feelings, or revealing her thoughts. Her voice has been erased, and with it, crucial evidence about how power actually operated at the Prussian court. Let me tell you about a completely different kind of royal mistress letter, letters of reconciliation after quarrels, because the relationships between royal mistresses and kings were often stormy, marked by jealousies, arguments, and temporary estrangements that required skilled letter writing to repair. According to research by Professor Carolyn Harris from the University of Toronto, whose work on royal relationships examines conflict and reconciliation, royal mistresses often had to navigate the difficult balance between asserting their own dignity and interests while also maintaining the king's affection, and letters of reconciliation reveal this balancing act. Let me tell you about Gabrielle d'Estrées, who was the beloved mistress of King Henry IV of France in the 1590s, and who was nearly acknowledged as queen before her sudden death in 1599. According to research by Professor Catherine Crawford from Vanderbilt University, whose work on French royal mistresses examines Gabrielle's relationship with Henry IV, Gabrielle and Henry had a passionate but tumultuous relationship marked by frequent quarrels, often about Henry's other relationships with women or about Gabrielle's demands for money and status. After one particularly severe quarrel in 1597, Gabrielle wrote a letter of reconciliation that, according to Professor Crawford's analysis, demonstrates masterful emotional manipulation. In this letter, preserved in French archives and analysed by Professor Crawford, Gabrielle wrote to Henri, "My king, my love, my heart, I write to you in tears, overcome with remorse for my harsh words and my unjust accusations. You were right, and I was wrong. You are the king, and you must do what is best for France, and I had no right to criticise your decisions, or to make demands that would compromise your duty. I was selfish and foolish, thinking only of my own desires and not of your responsibilities. Can you forgive me? I promise to be better, to be the companion you need rather than another burden you must carry. I promise to support you rather than complain, to comfort you rather than add to your troubles. I love you more than my own life, and I cannot bear the thought that I have disappointed you or made you doubt my devotion. Please, my dearest, let us put this quarrel behind us. Send me word that you forgive me, and I will prove my love through my actions and my reformed behaviour." This letter, according to Professor Crawford, is a masterpiece of what we might call strategic submission. Gabrielle takes complete blame for the quarrel, promises to reform, and positions herself as entirely devoted to Henri and his needs. But according to Professor Crawford, the letter's language of extreme self-abasement was actually a rhetorical strategy, designed to make Henri feel guilty and to reaffirm Gabrielle's devotion in terms so absolute that Henri would feel obligated to reciprocate with equal devotion and generosity. And it worked. According to historical records, Henri responded warmly, sent Gabrielle gifts and reassurances, and their relationship continued until her death 2 years later. Now let me tell you about royal mistress letters that were published, sometimes during the lifetimes of the writers, sometimes after their deaths, and how publication transformed private correspondence into public scandal or public entertainment. According to research by Professor Margaret C. Jacob from UCLA, whose work on Enlightenment culture examines print and publicity, the 18th century saw an explosion of published private letters, both genuine and forged, as an increasingly literate public became fascinated with intimate glimpses into the lives of the aristocracy and royalty. Let me tell you about the publication of letters purporting to be from Madame de Pompadour, published in the 1760s and 1770s during and after her lifetime. According to research by Professor Dana Goodman from the University of Michigan, whose work on Enlightenment salons examines Pompadour's cultural influence, some of these published letters were genuine, leaked by servants or stolen from correspondents, while others were complete fabrications, written by pamphleteers and pornographers who wanted to capitalize on public fascination with Pompadour's life and her relationship with Louis V. One collection of letters published in 1764, shortly after Pompadour's death, according to Professor Goodman, included both genuine correspondence and forged editions designed to make Pompadour seem more sexually scandalous than she actually was. The genuine letters showed Pompadour as intelligent, politically engaged, and emotionally complex, but the forged editions portrayed her in explicit sexual situations, described her involvement in orgies and sexual perversions, and generally catered to pornographic rather than historical interest. According to Professor Goodman, readers at the time often could not distinguish between the genuine and the forged, and Pompadour's reputation was damaged by the publication, even though she could not defend herself because she was dead. The publication of royal mistress letters, according to Professor Goodman, reflects the democratization of scandal in the 18th century, where once the private correspondence of kings and their mistresses would have remained secret, accessible only to the tiny elite at court, the spread of printing and literacy meant that anyone who could read and afford a pamphlet could read, or believe they were reading, the intimate words of royal mistresses to their lovers. This created new kinds of vulnerability for royal mistresses and new kinds of public interest in their private lives. Let me tell you about the discovery of hidden letters, because some of the most remarkable royal mistress letters were found centuries after they were written, hidden in secret compartments, tucked into the bindings of books, or preserved in family archives that only became accessible when descendants donated them to libraries or when scholars gained access to previously private collections. According to research by Professor Kate Williams from the University of Reading, whose work on royal history examines archival discoveries, the discovery of previously unknown royal mistress letters can change our understanding of historical relationships and events. Let me tell you about a cache of letters from Mary Robinson to the future King George IV of England. Discovered in the early 20th century in a private collection, Mary Robinson, known as Perdita because she played that role in Shakespeare's The Winter's Tale, was an actress who became the teenage prince of Wales's mistress in 1779 to 1780. According to research by Professor Paula Byrne from Oxford University, whose biography of Mary Robinson examines her life, Mary and the young prince exchanged passionate love letters during their brief relationship, and when the relationship ended, Mary kept the prince's letters as insurance, threatening to publish them unless he paid her an annuity. The letters from Mary to the prince that were discovered in the 20th century, according to Professor Byrne, reveal a relationship that was more than just a teenage infatuation. Mary's letters show her as intelligent, well-read, and politically aware, writing to the prince not just as a lover, but as someone who took seriously his future role as king. In one letter from 1780, analysed by Professor Byrne, Mary wrote to the prince, "My dearest love, I write to you not just as your Perdita, but as someone who sees in you the potential to be the greatest king England has ever known. You are intelligent, you are charming, you understand people and their needs in ways that your father never has. But you must discipline yourself. You must prepare yourself for the responsibilities that await you. Your current life of pleasure and extravagance, while understandable in one so young, cannot continue forever. When you are king, England will need you to be strong, wise, and dedicated to your people's welfare. Let me help you become the man and the king you are meant to be." This letter, according to Professor Byrne, shows Mary Robinson trying to position herself as more than a temporary sexual conquest, trying to become the prince's advisor and moral guide in ways similar to how Madame de Maintenon had positioned herself with Louis XIV. But unlike Maintenon, Mary did not succeed. The Prince of Wales, tired of her within a few months, ended the relationship, and Mary was left with his passionate letters promising eternal devotion and nothing else. She did extract an annuity from the prince in exchange for not publishing his letters, but it was never paid regularly, and she spent the rest of her life in financial difficulty, dying in poverty in 1800. Now, let me tell you about royal mistress letters in the 19th century, because the Romantic era brought new kinds of emotional expression and new conventions of love letters that influenced how royal mistresses wrote to their lovers. Let me tell you about Dorothea Leven, Princess Leven, who was not exactly a royal mistress, but who had intimate relationships with several of the most powerful men in early 19th century Europe, and whose letters are among the most brilliant and politically sophisticated correspondence of the era. According to research by Professor Harold Temperley from Cambridge University, whose work on Princess Leven examines her political influence, Dorothea Leven was the wife of the Russian ambassador to London and was deeply involved in European diplomacy during the Congress of Vienna period and afterward. She had intimate friendships and possibly affairs with several major political figures, including Prince Metternich of Austria and Earl Grey of Britain, and her letters to these men mixed personal affection with sophisticated political analysis in ways that influenced actual policy decisions. In a letter to Metternich from 1820, preserved in Austrian archives and analysed by Professor Temperley, Princess Leven wrote, "My dearest friend, I write to you with news that may interest you regarding British policy toward the Greek independence movement. I have had conversations with several members of the cabinet, and I sense a shift in their thinking. Where once they were completely opposed to supporting Greek independence from the Ottoman Empire, fearing that it would destabilise the entire region, they now seem more sympathetic to the Greek cause. Influenced by Romantic Philhellenism, and by Byron's involvement. This shift could have significant implications for Austrian policy and for the Congress system. I thought you should know of it immediately so that you can formulate your response. I await your thoughts on this matter with the eagerness of a pupil, awaiting her teacher's instruction, for you know I value your political wisdom above all others. But I await them also with the impatience of a woman who misses her dearest friend, and who counts the days until we can meet again. Your devoted Dorothea. This letter, according to Professor Temperley, demonstrates Princess Lieven's skill at blending personal and political correspondence. She provides valuable political intelligence that Metternich would need to formulate Austrian policy, but she frames it within language of personal friendship and even romance, with the reference to missing him and counting days until they meet. According to Professor Temperley, Princess Lieven's letters were often used by the men who received them as actual diplomatic intelligence, making her correspondence an unofficial channel of international communication that operated alongside formal diplomatic channels. Let me tell you about Lola Montez, born Eliza Gilbert in Ireland around 1821, who became the mistress of King Ludwig I of Bavaria in the 1840s, and whose letters reveal a woman who was simultaneously manipulative and self-destructive, politically ambitious, and personally chaotic. According to research by Professor Bruce Seymour, whose biography of Lola Montez examines her extraordinary life, Lola was a dancer of limited talent but considerable beauty and charisma, who convinced Ludwig I that she was a Spanish aristocrat and who dominated the aging king so completely, essentially controlled Bavarian policy for 2 years until a revolution in 1848 forced both Ludwig to abdicate and Lola to flee. Lola's letters to Ludwig, some preserved in Bavarian archives and analysed by Professor Seymour, reveal her using every emotional lever she could find to maintain her power over the king. In a letter from 1847, Lola wrote, "My dearest Ludwig, my king, my everything, I am in tears as I write this because I have just learned that your ministers are plotting to separate us, spreading lies about me, claiming that I am a foreign adventuress who has bewitched you. They are jealous of our love and afraid of my influence over you. But you must not listen to them. You must not let them drive me away. I love you more than life itself, and I cannot bear the thought of being separated from you. If you cast me aside, I will die of grief. I swear to you that I will die if you abandon me. Please, my love, prove to these small-minded bureaucrats that a king does not bow to the wishes of his servants, that you will not sacrifice our love for political convenience. Stand with me, and together we will show them all what true love and true power look like." This letter, according to Professor Seymour, combines declarations of love with emotional blackmail, threatening to die if Ludwig abandons her, political advice, don't bow to ministers, and an appeal to Ludwig's ego and sense of royal prerogative. According to Professor Seymour, Ludwig was completely captivated by Lola and did stand by her against his minister's advice, giving her enormous influence over appointments and policy. But this could not last. In March 1848, revolution broke out in Munich, largely sparked by popular hatred of Lola and resentment of her influence. Ludwig was forced to abdicate, and Lola fled, eventually ending up in America, where she continued her career as a dancer and lecturer until her death in 1861. Now let me tell you about how the invention of photography in the mid-19th century changed royal mistress correspondence, because mistresses could now send photographs of themselves to their royal lovers, creating new forms of intimate exchange and new kinds of scandal if the photographs were discovered. According to research by Professor Elizabeth Ann Macaulay from Princeton University, whose work on photography and privacy examines 19th century intimate photography, royal mistresses and their lovers began exchanging photographs in the 1850s and 1860s, with some photographs being quite explicit. Let me tell you about Virginia Oldoini, Countess of Castiglione, who was possibly the mistress of Emperor Napoleon III of France in the late 1850s. and who was certainly one of the first women to use photography as a tool of self-promotion and seduction. According to research by Professor Pierre Aprexine from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, whose work on the Countess of Castiglione examines her photographic legacy, the Countess commissioned hundreds of photographs of herself from the photographer Pierre-Louis Pierson, photographs that ranged from conventional portraits to highly theatrical and sensual images showing her in various costumes and poses. Some of these photographs, according to Professor Aprexine, were clearly intended for Napoleon III, including images showing the Countess in ball gowns that emphasized her notorious cleavage, which had allegedly first caught Napoleon III's attention. The Countess would send these photographs with letters to Napoleon III, creating multimedia correspondence that combined written words with visual images. In one letter from 1857, analysed by Professor Aprexine, the Countess wrote to Napoleon III, "Sire, I send you this photograph so that you can see me as I was at the ball last night, where every eye was upon me, but I saw only you. Keep this image with you and remember that the woman in this photograph belongs to you completely, body and soul, beauty and intelligence, everything I am and everything I have. When you look at this photograph, think of me and know that I am thinking of you always." The combination of photographic image and passionate letter, according to Professor Aprexine, created a powerful form of intimate communication that was new in the 1850s, and that would become increasingly common as photography became more accessible. For royal mistresses, photographs offered a way to remind their royal lovers of their physical beauty when they were separated, to compete with other women vying for the king's attention, and to create tangible objects that the king could keep with him as reminders of his mistress. Thank you for joining me tonight on this intimate journey through the secret correspondence of royal mistresses, through letters that were never meant to be read by anyone except the kings who received them, letters that reveal love and fear, passion and calculation, tenderness and desperation in measures that still move us centuries later. I hope these letters have helped you understand that the women who wrote them were not simply scandalous figures or historical curiosities, but complex human beings navigating impossible situations with whatever tools they had available, which often meant nothing more than pen and paper and the hope that their words would reach sympathetic ears. As we come to the end of our time together tonight, I want you to think about what these letters reveal about love and power, about the ways that women throughout history have used words to express desires, advance agendas, maintain connections, and fight for survival. These letters show us that romance and politics were never separate spheres, that declarations of love could also be diplomatic negotiations, that expressions of passion could serve strategic purposes, and that even the most intimate correspondence existed within frameworks of power that shaped every word. But beyond the politics and the strategy, these letters also show us genuine human feeling. Pompadour's fear of aging and loss, Nell's practical concern mixed with real affection, Barbara's consuming passion, Diane's maternal devotion, Louise's explicit longing, Emma's desperate love for Nelson, Katarzyna's coded conspiracies, and the terrified final letters of women facing abandonment, poverty, or death. All of these reveal women feeling and expressing the full range of human emotions within the constraints of their particular circumstances. Now let me tell you about letters written by royal mistresses during wartime, because war created particular challenges and opportunities for these women, separating them from their royal lovers, putting them in danger, but also sometimes giving them chances to prove their loyalty and usefulness in ways that secured their positions. Let me tell you about Frénoise de Foule, Countess of Chateaubriand, who was the mistress of King Francis I of France in the 1520s, during the period when France was at war with the Habsburg Empire, and when Francis was actually captured at the Battle of Pavia in 1525 and held prisoner in Spain for over a year. According to research by Professor R.J. Knecht from the University of Birmingham, whose work on Francis examines his reign, Frénoise de Foule was one of Francis's most beloved mistresses, known for her beauty, her intelligence, and her cultural sophistication. When Francis was captured in 1525, Franois wrote him letters that were smuggled to Spain by diplomatic couriers, letters that had to pass through enemy hands, and that therefore had to be carefully worded to avoid revealing sensitive information while still expressing personal devotion. In one letter from 1525, preserved in Spanish archives and analysed by Professor Knecht, Franois wrote to Francis, "My beloved Lord, I write to you in your captivity with a heart that breaks for your suffering and your absence. All of France mourns for its king and prays for your safe return. I add my prayers to theirs, though my prayers are motivated by personal love rather than patriotic duty. I pray that your captors treat you with the honour due to a king and a valiant warrior. I pray that negotiations for your release proceed swiftly. I pray that you remain strong in spirit even as your body is confined. And I pray selfishly that when you return to France, you will remember the woman who never ceased to think of you during your captivity, who remained faithful to you though you were far away, and who awaits your return with an impatience that makes every day feel like a year." This letter, according to Professor Knecht, demonstrates how royal mistresses had to balance personal and political considerations in their correspondence. Franois could not write anything too intimate or too politically sensitive, knowing that Spanish authorities might read the letter before it reached Francis, but she could express devotion in terms that were both personally meaningful and politically acceptable, positioning herself as a faithful lover who remained constant during his captivity. According to Professor Knecht, Francis did return to France in 1526, and his relationship with Franois continued until her death around 1537, suggesting that her letters and her demonstrated faithfulness during his captivity had secured her place in his affections. Let me tell you about Harriet Wilson, who was the mistress of multiple aristocratic and royal men in Regency England, including the Duke of Wellington and various princes, and who became famous or infamous for threatening to publish her memoirs, including details of her relationships, unless her former lovers paid her not to do so. According to research by Professor Hallie Rubenhold from the University of London, whose work on Regency courtesans examines Harriet Wilson, she was one of the first women to use the threat of publication as a weapon to extract money from former lovers, essentially inventing the modern kiss, and tell memoir as blackmail. In 1825, Harriet Wilson published Memoirs of Harriet Wilson, written by herself, which included detailed accounts of her relationships with various aristocratic lovers, supplemented by what she claimed were actual letters that these men had written to her. According to Professor Rubenhold, some of these letters were genuine, while others were probably fabricated or embellished by Harriet to make her memoirs more scandalous and more commercially successful. The book was an enormous bestseller, going through multiple editions and making Harriet a substantial amount of money while destroying or damaging the reputations of the men she wrote about. One letter that Harriet claimed was from the Duke of Wellington, published in her memoirs and analysed by Professor Rubenhold, read, "My dear Harriette, I think of you constantly, even in the midst of military campaigns and affairs of state. Your beauty haunts me, your wit delights me, your body enslaves me. When can we meet again? I count the hours until I can hold you in my arms and show you the depth of my devotion. Until then, I remain your most ardent admirer and devoted servant." When the memoirs were published, the Duke of Wellington famously responded to Harriet's demand for money with the terse reply, "Publish and be damned." He was one of the few men who refused to pay, confident that his reputation could withstand the scandal. Whether this particular letter was genuine or fabricated, according to Professor Rubenhold, Harriet Wilson's memoirs represent a turning point in the history of royal and aristocratic mistresses. For the first time, a mistress had successfully weaponized her own story and her lover's letters, using publication not just as revenge but as a business model. This created a new vulnerability for powerful men involved with mistresses, the risk not just of private scandal but of public exposure, not just of whispered gossip at court but of printed books that anyone could read. From 1825 onward, according to Professor Rubenhold, aristocratic men had to consider whether a woman they were involved with might someday write a memoir, exposing their relationship and royal mistresses had a new form of leverage and a new way to support themselves after relationships ended. Now, let me tell you about letters between royal mistresses and each other, because mistresses sometimes corresponded with each other, forming alliances, sharing advice, or engaging in rivalries that were expressed through written words. According to research by Professor Sarah Richardson from the University of Warwick, whose work on women's correspondence examines female letter networks, royal mistresses existed in a small, competitive world where other mistresses were simultaneously potential allies who understood their unique position and potential rivals who might replace them in the king's affections. Let me tell you about a letter from Madame de Pompadour to Madame du Barry, written shortly before Pompadour's death in 1764, when du Barry was beginning her relationship with Louis XV, according to research by Professor Christine Adams from St. Mary's College of Maryland, whose work on French court women examines their relationships. Pompadour and du Barry never actually met, as Pompadour died just as du Barry was rising. But Pompadour was aware of du Barry and reportedly wrote to her with advice about how to maintain the king's favour. In this letter, analysed by Professor Adams and preserved in French private archives, Pompadour allegedly wrote to du Barry, "Mademoiselle, though we will never meet, I write to you as one who has walked the path you now begin to one who will follow in my footsteps. You have captured the king's attention through your beauty and your spirit, and you enjoy now the passion and the favour that I once knew. But let me warn you, passion fades, beauty ages, and favour is the most fragile thing in the world. If you wish to keep the king's love beyond the first flowering of lust, you must make yourself necessary to him in ways that transcend the physical. Be his confidante, his comfort, his escape from the burdens of kingship. Learn what worries him and find ways to ease those worries. Study what pleases him and provide those pleasures before he asks for them. Never make demands, but let your needs be known in ways that make him feel generous rather than constrained. And above all, remember that you have no rights, no security, no future except what you can secure through your own wit and effort. The court will hate you. The queen will despise you. The ministers will try to use you or destroy you depending on whether they think you can be controlled. Trust no one completely. Love the king sincerely but not blindly. And save money while you can, for the day will come when you will need it, and there will be no one to help you." Whether this letter is genuine or apocryphal is debated by historians, according to Professor Adams. But whether Pompadour actually wrote it or whether it was a later fabrication, the letter expresses truths about the position of royal mistresses that all of them would have understood. The advice to make yourself necessary beyond physical beauty, to manage the king's emotions skillfully, to trust no one, to save money against inevitable decline. All of this reflects the realities that royal mistresses faced. And the tone of the letter, weary but not bitter, experienced but not cynical, passing on hard-won wisdom to a successor, reflects a possible solidarity between women who occupied the same difficult position, even if they never met and might have been rivals if circumstances had been different. Let me tell you about letters that royal mistresses wrote to their children, because the children born to royal mistresses occupied painfully ambiguous positions, acknowledged as royal blood but illegitimate, given titles and support but excluded from succession, and the letters that mistresses wrote to these children reveal both maternal love and the complications of their situation. According to research by Professor Clarissa Campbell-Orr from Anglia Ruskin University, whose work on royal illegitimacy examines the lives of royal bastards, royal mistresses often had to navigate complex relationships with their children, who were usually taken from them to be raised in aristocratic households, or who lived with their mothers, but were constantly reminded of their irregular birth. Let me tell you about a letter from Barbara Villiers to her son Charles Fitzroy, who became the Duke of Southampton, written around 1670, when Charles was still a child being raised in a noble household, away from his mother according to research by Professor Laura Gowing from King's College London, whose work on gender and family in early modern England examines mother-child relationships. Barbara wrote to her son, "My dearest child, I write to you from court where I remain close to your father the king, working always to secure your future and the futures of your brothers and sisters. I know that you must sometimes wonder why you do not live with me as other children live with their mothers, why you are raised by strangers in a grand house rather than in your mother's arms. The answer is complicated, and perhaps you are still too young to understand it fully, but I will try to explain. You are the king's son, and that makes you both very fortunate and very burdened. Fortunate because you will have rank, wealth, and opportunities that most children could never dream of. Burdened because you will also face scorn and prejudice from those who believe that birth outside marriage is shameful. No matter whose son you are, you must be raised to be strong, educated, capable of holding your own among the nobles who will be your peers and your rivals. I cannot give you that education and training, but the household where you live can. Know that I love you, that I think of you constantly, and that everything I do here at court is done partly to secure your position and your inheritance. When you are older, you will understand better why things had to be this way. Until then, be a good boy, study hard, and make your mother proud." This letter, according to Professor Gowing, reveals the painful reality for royal mistresses who had children by kings. The children were valuable because they were royal, but that very value meant they had to be raised away from their mothers, educated to a standard that the mothers often could not provide, groomed for positions at court and in society that required noble upbringing. Barbara Villiers did see her children and maintained relationships with them, but the relationships were complicated by the circumstances of their birth and by the fact that their futures depended on the king's favour, which meant that Barbara's relationship with Charles II had implications not just for her but for her children's entire lives. Now let me tell you about letters from royal mistresses to queens, because occasionally mistresses and queens corresponded directly, sometimes in bitter rivalry, sometimes in unexpected alliance. According to research by Professor Tracy Borman from the University of London, whose work on Tudor and Stuart courts examines royal women, the relationship between queens and their husbands' mistresses varied enormously depending on personalities, circumstances, and the power dynamics at specific courts. Some queens bitterly resented their husbands' mistresses and worked to destroy them. Others pragmatically accepted that kings would have mistresses and tried to manage the situation to minimize damage to themselves and their children. Let me tell you about a fascinating exchange of letters between Queen Catherine of Braganza, wife of Charles II of England, and Barbara Villiers, Charles's most powerful mistress. According to research by Professor Estelle Perranque from the New College of the Humanities, whose work on Queen's Consort examines their political strategies, Catherine and Barbara had a complex relationship that evolved from bitter enmity to a kind of cold, pragmatic acceptance. In 1663, when Charles II tried to force Catherine to accept Barbara as a lady of the bedchamber, essentially forcing the Queen to have the king's mistress as part of her household, Catherine initially refused, leading to a confrontation that threatened to create a major political crisis. In a letter from this period, analysed by Professor Perranque and preserved in Portuguese archives, Catherine wrote to Barbara, "Madam, the king has commanded me to accept you into my household as a lady of the bedchamber. This command places me in an impossible position. As a wife and as a queen, I cannot willingly embrace the woman who has taken my husband's affections and who flaunts her position as his favourite. As a Catholic and a Christian, I cannot condone adultery by accepting its living evidence into my own chambers. And yet, as a queen consort in a foreign land, I have little power to resist the king's commands. I write to you not to plead or to threaten, for I have no basis for either, but simply to ask that you consider my position with some compassion. You have the king's love, his time, his passion, his gift. You have borne him children that I have not been able to give him. You have a security in his affections that I will never possess. Is it necessary for you to also have my public humiliation, to serve in my household as a constant reminder of my failure as a wife? I ask you, woman to woman, not to accept this position, to tell the king that you would prefer some other honour, to spare me this particular indignity. This letter, according to Professor Parank, is remarkable for its dignity and its emotional honesty. Catherine does not pretend to accept the situation cheerfully, but she also does not threaten or condemn Barbara. Instead, she appeals to Barbara's compassion and makes a reasonable request that Barbara decline the position. Barbara's response, according to Professor Parank, was to accept the position anyway, demonstrating her power over both the king and the queen. But according to historical records, over time Catherine and Barbara developed a working relationship that was not friendly but was pragmatic, with Catherine eventually accepting that she could not change Charles's behaviour and focusing instead on maintaining her own dignity and securing her own position at court. Let me tell you about Lily Langtry, known as the Jersey Lily, who was the mistress of the Prince of Wales, later King Edward VII, in the late 1870s and early 1880s, and whose letters reveal how the role of royal mistress was changing in the late Victorian era, becoming more public and more connected to celebrity culture. According to research by Professor Jane Ridley from the University of Buckingham, whose biography of Edward VII examines his many relationships with women, Lily Langtry was one of the first royal mistresses to leverage her connection to royalty into a public career, using her fame as the Prince of Wales's mistress to launch a successful career as an actress and socialite. Lily's letters to the Prince of Wales, some preserved in the royal archives and analysed by Professor Ridley, show a woman who was affectionate but also pragmatic about the temporary nature of the relationship. In a letter from 1878, Lily wrote to the prince, "My dearest Bertie, I treasure every moment we spend together, knowing that these precious hours are stolen from your duties and your proper life. I do not deceive myself that our relationship can last forever, or that you will be mine alone for very long. You are a prince, you will be king, you have obligations that I do not share and cannot fully understand. But I hope that when our time together ends, as it inevitably must, you will remember me with affection and will help me establish myself in some respectable profession so that I do not end my days in poverty and disgrace. I do not ask to be kept in luxury forever, but only that you help me help myself, that you use your influence to open doors that would otherwise be closed to a woman of my irregular position. And I hope that when you have moved on to other loves, as I know you will, we can still be friends, still value what we shared, still speak kindly of each other to others." This letter, according to Professor Ridley, shows Lily Langtry's intelligence and her clear-eyed understanding of her position. She did not expect to be the prince's permanent mistress. She did not demand that he remain faithful to her, and she explicitly framed her request for future help in terms of helping her help herself, rather than in terms of being kept as a dependent pensioner. This reflected the changing nature of royal mistresses in the late 19th century, according to Professor Ridley, where earlier royal mistresses had typically depended entirely on royal generosity and had faced poverty if that generosity ended. Late Victorian mistresses like Lily Langtry had more options, could pursue careers and could leverage their royal connections into public celebrity that had its own economic value. The Prince of Wales did help Lily Langtry launch her acting career, using his influence to secure her roles and audiences, and when their romantic relationship ended around 1880, they did remain friends, exactly as Lily's letter had suggested. Lily went on to have a successful career on the stage, made her own fortune, married again, and lived comfortably until her death in 1937, one of the few royal mistresses who managed to parlay her position into long-term security and success. Now let me tell you about the 20th century and how the nature of royal mistress letters changed with the advent of new technologies and new media. Let me tell you about Wallis Simpson, who was not exactly a mistress in the traditional sense, since she married King Edward VIII after he abdicated in 1936, but who certainly occupied the position of royal mistress before the abdication, and whose letters to Edward reveal a modern sensibility very different from the royal mistresses of earlier centuries. According to research by Professor Philip Ziegler, whose biography of Edward VIII examines the abdication crisis. Wallis Simpson and Edward VIII conducted an extensive correspondence during the 1930s, when Edward was Prince of Wales, and Wallis was still married to her second husband, Ernest Simpson. These letters, preserved in various archives and partially published, reveal a relationship that mixed genuine affection with neurotic dependency on Edward's part and manipulative calculation on Wallis's part. In a letter from 1935, analysed by Professor Ziegler, Wallis wrote to Edward, "My darling boy, I've just returned from a party where everyone was whispering about us, about whether you'll marry me, about whether I'll be queen, about what your family thinks of me. It is exhausting being the centre of so much speculation and gossip. Sometimes I wonder whether we should end this before it becomes even more complicated, before we hurt people who don't deserve to be hurt, before we create a scandal that neither of us can recover from. But then I think of you and I know I can't give you up, no matter how difficult this becomes. You need me, darling. You've told me so many times that you can't live without me, and I believe you. So we'll continue, we'll face whatever comes, and we'll hope that somehow things work out for us. But darling, you must be discreet. You must not be so obvious in your devotion. People talk, and the more they talk, the harder this becomes for both of us. Be patient, be careful, and trust me to manage this situation as best I can." This letter, according to Professor Ziegler, shows Wallis Simpson trying to manage an increasingly impossible situation, while also revealing some genuine concern for the consequences of the relationship. By 1935, Edward's obsession with Wallis was becoming public knowledge, creating a constitutional crisis that would eventually lead to his abdication. Wallis's suggestion that they might end the relationship before it became too complicated suggests either that she didn't yet realize how far Edward would go for her, or that she was trying to test his devotion or manipulate him into demonstrating it more dramatically. The letters between Wallis and Edward also reveal how technology was changing royal correspondence by the 1930s. According to Professor Ziegler, they spoke on the telephone regularly, something that earlier royal mistresses and their lovers could not do. They sent telegrams for urgent communications, and they had to worry about new forms of surveillance and disclosure, telephone taps, photographers with telephoto lenses, journalists investigating their relationship. The privacy that royal mistresses of earlier centuries could sometimes maintain, even if they were known to be mistresses, was much harder to achieve in the age of mass media and modern communication technology. Let me tell you about letters that were used as evidence in legal proceedings, because royal mistress letters sometimes ended up in courts, divorce proceedings, parliamentary investigations, or trials, where they served as evidence of adultery, political conspiracy, or financial corruption. According to research by Professor Amanda Vickery from Queen Mary University of London, whose work on women and law examines women's litigation, women's letters were often used against them in legal proceedings, with intimate expressions of love or passion presented as evidence of immoral character or unreliability. Let me tell you about the divorce case of Queen Caroline of Brunswick, estranged wife of King George IV, who was put on trial before Parliament in 1820 on charges of adultery with an Italian servant named Bartolomeo Pergami. According to research by Professor E.A. Smith from the University of Reading, whose work on George IV examines his reign, Caroline's trial involved the presentation of letters that were claimed to be from Caroline to Pergami, letters that were supposedly evidence of their adulterous relationship. One letter that was read aloud in Parliament and analysed by Professor Smith, allegedly written by Caroline to Pergami in Italian and translated for the proceedings, read, "My dearest friend, the hours we spent together yesterday were the happiest I have known in years. When I am with you, I forget the bitterness of my marriage, the cruelty of my husband, the loneliness of my exile. You treat me with a tenderness and respect that my husband never showed me. You make me feel like a woman rather than a political inconvenience. I count the hours until we can be together again, until I can feel your arms around me and your lips on mine. Until then, I remain yours completely and forever. Whether this letter was genuinely from Caroline or was forged by those seeking to destroy her was hotly debated even at the time. According to Professor Smith, Caroline claimed the letters were fabrications, and many members of Parliament were sceptical about their authenticity. The trial ultimately failed to convict Caroline, partly because the evidence was seen as unreliable, and partly because public opinion was sympathetic to Caroline, who was viewed as a wronged wife being persecuted by a hypocritical king who had himself had numerous mistresses and illegitimate children. But the mere reading of these letters in Parliament, whether genuine or forged, served to humiliate Caroline and to demonstrate how royal mistress letters, or letters that were claimed to be from royal mistresses or queens, could be weaponized in political and legal conflicts. Now let me tell you about letters that mistresses wrote justifying their positions, defending their reputations, or trying to shape how they would be remembered by history. According to research by Professor Carolyn Steedman from the University of Warwick, whose work on women's writing examined self-representation, some royal mistresses wrote letters specifically intended for posterity, letters that were designed to be preserved and read by future generations as explanations or justifications of their lives and choices. Let me tell you about a letter from Madame du Barry, written sometime in the 1780s before the Revolution, addressed to no specific recipient, but clearly intended as a kind of testament or apologia. According to research by Professor Joan Haslip, whose biography of Madame du Barry examines her life, this letter was preserved in du Barry's papers and discovered after her death. In it, du Barry wrote, "To whoever may read this letter in years to come, I write to explain myself and my life, knowing that history will likely judge me harshly, and that those who know my name will know it primarily as that of a royal mistress, a kept woman, a courtesan who rose to influence through beauty and sex rather than through virtue and merit. But I want to be understood as more than just a scandalous figure in the king's bed. I was born into poverty, into circumstances that gave me almost no options for survival except through my beauty and my ability to please men. I did not choose to be born poor, to be born beautiful, to be born female in a world that gave women so few paths to security and comfort. I chose to use what I had to survive and to thrive. When the king noticed me and desired me, I could have refused him, and I would have been virtuous, and I would have been poor and forgotten. Instead, I accepted his favour, and I have lived in luxury and influence for years, and I regret nothing. I have hurt no one. I have been generous to those in need. I have supported artists and craftsmen. I have brought beauty and pleasure into the world. If that makes me a sinner in the eyes of God and society, so be it. I would make the same choices again if I had them to make." This letter, according to Professor Haslip, is remarkable for its defiance and its refusal to apologise. Du Barry did not express regret for her life as a royal mistress, did not claim that she had been an innocent victim of male lust or royal power, did not present herself as a reformed sinner seeking forgiveness. Instead, she defended her choices as rational responses to the circumstances she faced, and asserted that she had lived well and hurt no one. The letter was written before the revolution destroyed her life, before her terror and execution, and it represents Du Barry at her most confident and unapologetic, a woman who had risen from nothing to the heights of power and luxury, and who intended to be remembered on her own terms. Let me tell you about letters between royal mistresses and their families, because mistresses often had to navigate complicated relationships with parents, siblings, and other relatives who might be shocked by their positions, might try to exploit their connections to royalty, or might be affected positively or negatively by their scandalous relationships. According to research by Professor Susan E. Wyman from the University of London, whose work on letter writing and family examines correspondence networks, family letters reveal much about the social impact of becoming a royal mistress, about how it changed a woman's relationship with her family of origin, and how families responded to having a member in such a position. Let me tell you about letters from Nell Gwynn to her mother, who was apparently a bawd who ran a brothel, and to her sister Rose, who was also an actress. According to research by Professor John Harold Wilson, whose work on Nell Gwyn we discussed earlier, Nell maintained contact with her family throughout her life, supporting them financially and defending them against criticism from those at court who thought the king's mistress should distance herself from her low-born relatives. In a letter from around 1675, analysed by Professor Wilson and preserved in family papers, Nell wrote to her sister Rose, "Dearest Rose, I hear that some at court have been saying that I should be ashamed of my family, that I should pretend to be of noble birth rather than acknowledge that our mother was a bawd, and our childhood was spent in poverty and disreputability. But I will never deny where I came from. You are my sister, my own blood, and I love you no matter what the fine ladies at court think of it. Let them sneer at my origins. I know who I am and where I came from, and I am not ashamed. The king loves me knowing exactly what my background is, and if he does not care, why should I care what his courtiers think? Come visit me when you can. We'll laugh together about the absurdity of your baby sister living in royal apartments and being called madam by servants, when we both know that just a few years ago I was selling oranges in the theatre pit." This letter, according to Professor Wilson, reveals Nell Gwyn's remarkable strength of character and her refusal to be ashamed of her origins despite pressure to deny or minimize her humble background. This honesty about her past was part of what made Nell popular with the public, according to Professor Wilson. She never pretended to be something she wasn't, never claimed noble ancestry, never tried to erase her background, and her loyalty to her family, her willingness to support them and associate with them, despite criticism, endeared her to many who saw her as genuine and unaffected, despite her royal connections. Now let me tell you about the final letters of royal mistresses. The letters written at the very end of their lives, looking back on their years of power and passion and reflecting on what it all meant. According to research by Professor Judith Harrin from King's College London, whose work on women's history examines women's life writing, the letters that women wrote near the end of their lives often reveal a different perspective from the letters they wrote during their active years, with more reflection, sometimes more regret, sometimes more wisdom, sometimes more bitterness. Let me tell you about a letter from Diane de Poitiers, written shortly before her death in 1566, addressed to her grandchildren. According to research by Professor Ivan Clulas, whose biography of Diane we discussed earlier, this letter was discovered in family archives and reveals Diane looking back on her long life and her years as Henry II's mistress. In the letter, analysed by Professor Clulas, Diane wrote, "My dear grandchildren, I write to you from my chateau at Anet, where I have lived these 7 years since the king's death, removed from court and from power, but not unhappy. I want to tell you about my life, about the choices I made and what they cost and what they gained, so that you may learn from my experiences. I was the mistress of King Henry II for over 20 years, wielding more power than any woman in France except the Queen, shaping policy, controlling appointments, accumulating enormous wealth. I lived in luxury and splendour. I was feared and courted and envied, and I do not regret it. The king loved me truly, I believe, and I loved him, and we brought each other happiness and comfort in a world that offered little of either. But I also paid a price. I was hated by many at court who resented my influence. I was condemned by moralists who saw me as a wicked woman leading the king into sin. I was separated from my own family for long periods, prioritizing the king's needs over my own relatives. And when the king died, all my power evaporated instantly, and I was forced to return properties and titles that I had thought were mine by right of the king's love. I learned that nothing is permanent, that power based on personal favour is as fragile as morning dew, that love alone cannot protect you from the consequences of living outside the bounds of law and respectability. If I had it to do again, would I make the same choices? Yes, I believe I would. But I would go into it with fewer illusions, with more awareness of how temporary it all is, with more care to protect myself against the inevitable day when the king's love or the king's life ends. Learn from my story, my dears. Live boldly if you wish. Love passionately if you can. But always remember that the world is hard and unforgiving, especially to women who transgress its rules, and that you must always have something to fall back on when the bright days end. This letter, according to Professor Clueless, is remarkable for its honesty and its wisdom. Diane did not pretend that being a royal mistress was easy or risk-free, but she also did not regret her choices or present herself as a victim. She had lived fully, loved deeply, wielded real power, and enjoyed great luxury. And while it had all ended when Henry died, she looked back on those years without bitterness, seeing them as worth the price she had paid. And her advice to her grandchildren to live boldly but protect themselves, to be aware of risks while still taking them, reflects hard-earned wisdom about how to navigate a world that was hostile to women's independence and women's agency. Let me tell you about Camilla Parker Bowles, now Queen Camilla, whose letters to King Charles III before their marriage reveal how the tradition of royal mistresses extended even into the late 20th century, though in forms adapted to modern sensibilities and eventually culminating in marriage rather than in permanent mistress status. According to research by Professor Penny Junor, whose biographies of Charles and Camilla examine their long relationship, Charles and Camilla conducted a lengthy correspondence during the decades when Charles was married to Princess Diana and when Camilla was married to Andrew Parker Bowles. Letters that documented their enduring love and their frustration at being unable to be together publicly. In a letter from 1989 revealed during Diana's divorce proceedings and analysed by Professor Junor, Camilla wrote to Charles, "My darling, I miss you more than words can express. Every day that we cannot be together properly openly as we should be feels like a waste of the precious time we have on this earth. I know the obstacles we face. I know your position makes it impossible for you to simply leave your marriage and be with me. I know that my own marriage complicates everything. And I know that the public would never accept us, that they see you as married to Diana and see me as the wicked other woman destroying a fairy tale romance. But we know the truth, don't we, darling? We know that you and I are meant to be together, that what we have is real and deep and lasting in ways that your marriage to Diana never could be. Someday, somehow, we will find a way to be together properly. Until then, we must be patient, discreet, and faithful to each other, even when we cannot be faithful to our spouses. I love you more than anything, and I will wait for you however long it takes." This letter, according to Professor Junor, shows both the continuity and the change in royal mistress relationships by the late 20th century. The emotions are the same as in letters written centuries earlier. The frustration at being kept apart, the assertion that their love is true and legitimate even though society condemns it, the promise to wait and to remain faithful. But the context is completely different. Charles and Camilla couldn't simply conduct their affair openly and wait for Charles to become king and officially acknowledge Camilla as his mistress, as kings in earlier centuries might have done. They had to contend with modern media scrutiny, with public opinion, with the institution of monarchy, trying to maintain an image of family values and propriety. And yet, unlike almost any royal mistress in history before her, Camilla eventually did marry her royal lover, becoming first his wife and then, when Charles became king in 2022, Queen Consort and eventually Queen Camilla. The story of Charles and Camilla, according to Professor Junor, represents both the end of the traditional royal mistress system and a kind of victory for the values that royal mistresses' letters often expressed, that true love matters more than propriety, that personal happiness is worth fighting for even against enormous obstacles, that patience and persistence can eventually overcome social disapproval. Camilla went from being one of the most hated women in Britain, blamed for the breakdown of Charles's marriage to the beloved Princess Diana, to being accepted as Charles's wife, and eventually as queen. No historical royal mistress ever achieved such a complete transformation from scandalous lover to legitimate royal consort. Now, let me tell you about royal mistresses in the Austrian Habsburg court, because the Habsburgs had their own traditions and their own fascinating mistress correspondence. let me tell you about Katharina Schratt, who was the companion and possibly mistress of Emperor Franz Joseph I of Austria from the 1880s until his death in 1916. According to research by Professor Brigitte Hamann from the University of Vienna, whose biography of Katharina Schratt examines her relationship with Franz Joseph, Katharina was an actress who became the emperor's intimate friend and confidante during a period when his marriage to Empress Elizabeth was effectively over, with Elizabeth travelling constantly and showing little interest in court life or in her husband. Franz Joseph and Katharina exchanged thousands of letters over their 30-year relationship, letters that are preserved in Austrian archives and that reveal a relationship that was deeply affectionate but probably platonic, at least in its physical dimension. According to Professor Hamann, the letters show Franz Joseph treating Katharina as the companion his wife refused to be, sharing his daily concerns, his political worries, his private thoughts about family and duty. In a letter from 1890, analysed by Professor Hamann, Franz Joseph wrote to Katharina, "My dearest friend, I have just returned from a difficult meeting with ministers regarding the Hungarian question, and my first thought is to write to you and tell you about it because you are the only person who listens to my concerns without judging me or using what I say for political advantage. The Empress is in Corfu and writes rarely. My children are occupied with their own lives. The court is full of people who want things from me. But you, my dear Kathy, you want nothing except my happiness, and you give me the comfort of your companionship without demands or expectations. I count the hours until I can visit you tomorrow at the Villa Felicitas, and we can take tea together and talk about nothing important, and I can for a few hours forget that I am emperor and just be a man with a dear friend." This letter, according to Professor Hamann, perfectly captures the nature of Franz Joseph and Katharina's relationship. She was not a politically powerful mistress, like Pompadour or Montespan. She did not bear the emperor children. She did not seek wealth or titles beyond what Franz Joseph chose to give her. Instead, she provided companionship, emotional support, and a refuge from the burdens of imperial duty. Katharina's letters back to Franz Joseph, according to Professor Hamann, were equally affectionate, but appropriately respectful, always addressing him with proper titles, always acknowledging the difference in their stations, but also providing the warmth and emotional intimacy that his marriage lacked. Katharina Schratt, according to Professor Hamann, was tolerated and even supported by Empress Elizabeth, who understood that her husband needed companionship she was unwilling to provide, and who apparently felt grateful that Katharina kept Franz Joseph happy without creating scandal or political complications. After Elizabeth was assassinated in 1898, Katharina became even more important to Franz Joseph as his primary emotional support. She remained devoted to him until his death in 1916, and she preserved the correspondence, which became a valuable historical record of the emperor's private thoughts during the final decades of the Habsburg Empire. Let me tell you about letters that royal mistresses wrote during serious illness, because illness created particular vulnerability and often prompted letters of unusual emotional intensity. Let me tell you about Louise de la Valliere's letters to Louis XIV during a serious illness in 1669, letters that reveal both her physical suffering and her spiritual crisis as she contemplated her mortality and the sinful nature, as she saw it, of her relationship with the king. According to research by Professor Jean-Christian Petitfils from Paris Sorbonne University, whose work on Louis XIV examines his mistresses, Louise de la Valliere was genuinely religious and was increasingly troubled by the fact that her relationship with Louis XIV constituted adultery and was condemned by the Church. When she fell seriously ill in 1669, fearing she might die, she wrote to Louis XIV in terms very different from her earlier passionate letters. In a letter analysed by Professor Petitfils and preserved in French archives, Louise wrote, "Sire, I write from my sickbed, where the doctors tell me I may not recover. I have made my confession and received the sacraments, and my priest has made clear to me that I cannot receive absolution, while continuing in sin with you. I am terrified, sire, not of death itself, but of dying in mortal sin and facing God's judgment for the adultery I have committed with you. I have loved you more than my own soul, and that is the problem. I should have loved God above all things, and instead I loved you. I should have refused your advances and preserved my virtue, and instead I welcomed you to my bed and gloried in my sin. Now, facing death, I see clearly what I should have seen all along, that earthly love, no matter how intense and joyful, cannot compare to divine love, and that I have jeopardized my eternal salvation for temporary pleasures. If I survive this illness, sire, I must leave you. I must retire to a convent and spend the rest of my days in prayer and penance, seeking forgiveness for what we have done together. Forgive me for this decision, but I must save my soul, even if it costs me your love. This letter, according to Professor Petitfils, shocked Louis IV, who had not expected Louise to choose religion over their relationship. Louise did survive her illness, and within a few years she did indeed retire to a Carmelite convent, where she lived in strict penance and poverty until her death in 1710, over 40 years later. Her letters from the convent, some of which survive and are analysed by Professor Petitfils, show her living in conscious repentance for her years as Louise's mistress, subjecting herself to harsh physical mortifications, and writing to the king only rarely and always in terms of spiritual guidance, rather than romantic love. The transformation from passionate lover to penitent noon, according to Professor Petitfils, makes Louise de la Vallière unique among royal mistresses, where most either stayed with their royal lovers until death or abandonment, or moved on to other relationships. Louise chose a path of religious renunciation, publicly repudiating her past and embracing a life of extreme austerity as atonement. Her illness letters mark the beginning of this transformation, showing a woman who, when facing death, chose God over the king and eternal salvation over earthly love. Now let me tell you about letters between rival mistresses, because kings often had multiple mistresses simultaneously, and the rivalries between them sometimes played out in written correspondence that ranged from cold politeness to open warfare. According to research by Professor Arlette Juana from the University of Montpellier, whose work on French royal courts examines court intrigue, the competition between royal mistresses could be intense, with women fighting for the king's attention, his gifts, his time, and ultimately for the security that came from being the favourite. Let me tell you about the rivalry between Louise de la Vallière and Madame de Montespan, who overlapped as mistresses of Louis XIV in the late 1660s and early 1670s. According to Professor Juana, Montespan deliberately set out to supplant Louise in the king's affections, using her superior wit, her more overt sexuality, and her aristocratic confidence to make Louise seem dull and overly pious. By comparison, the two women apparently exchanged letters during this period, though most have not survived or were destroyed. One letter that does survive, analysed by Professor Juana and preserved in private family archives, is allegedly from Montespan to Louise, written around 1668, when Montespan was beginning to attract Louise's attention. In this letter, Montespan wrote with devastating false sympathy, "Ma chère Louise, I write to express my concern for you, having observed that the king seems somewhat distracted during your recent visits with him. I hope that there is no problem between you, no cooling of the affection that has sustained you these past years. If there is anything I can do to help as a friend and fellow woman at court, please do not hesitate to ask. I know how difficult it can be when a royal favourite begins to sense that the king's interest is waning, and I would gladly offer whatever advice or support might be useful. Of course, I may be mistaken in my observations. Perhaps the king is simply preoccupied with affairs of state, and his distraction has nothing to do with his feelings for you. I do hope that is the case, but if you should need a friend to confide in, I am here for you. Your devoted servant, Athenais." This letter, according to Professor Juana, is a masterpiece of false concern masking genuine malice. Every word of sympathy is actually a reminder to Louise that her position is threatened, that Montespan has noticed the king's cooling interest, and that Montespan is positioning herself as the sympathetic friend who will be there to comfort Louise when she is inevitably cast aside. The letter worked. According to Professor Joanna, Louise was deeply hurt by it, recognizing the mockery beneath the surface sympathy, and the stress of competing with Montespan contributed to Louise's eventual decision to retire to a convent. Montespan, of course, did replace Louise as Louis XIV's official mistress, holding that position for over a decade before being herself supplanted by younger women. Let me tell you about letters that royal mistresses wrote attempting to reconcile kings with their legitimate wives, because surprisingly, some mistresses tried to improve the king's marriage rather than undermine it. According to research by Professor Jeroen Douwendam from the University of Leiden, whose work on European royal courts examines court politics, some mistresses understood that a king's contentious relationship with his queen could create political problems that ultimately affected everyone at court, including mistresses whose positions depended on court stability. Let me tell you about a letter from Madame de Maintenon to Louis XIV, written around 1684, shortly after their secret marriage, but before her influence over Louis was fully established. According to research by Professor Ruth Kleinman, whose biography of Maintenon we discussed earlier, Maintenon wrote to Louis urging him to treat the late Queen Marie, Phaedruse's memory, with more respect and to honour her virtue, even though she was dead. In the letter, analysed by Professor Kleinman, Maintenon wrote, "Sire, I write to you about a matter that troubles my conscience. Since the Queen's death, I have heard courtiers speak of her with disrespect, implying that she was dull and that you found her boring, that your relationship with her was merely a duty you endured. This grieves me, sire, for the Queen was a good and virtuous woman who bore you children and maintained your household with dignity. She did not deserve to be mocked after her death by those seeking to flatter you by denigrating her. I ask you, sire, to speak more respectfully of her memory and to silence those who disparage her. Not only is it the charitable Christian thing to do, but it is also politically wise. If you allow your wife to be mocked, what message does that send about the institution of marriage? How can your subjects respect the sanctity of matrimony if the king himself shows disrespect for his late wife? And selfishly, sire, if people see you treat the Queen's memory with contempt, they will assume you will eventually treat me the same way, and that knowledge undermines my position and my ability to serve you effectively." This letter, according to Professor Kleinman, reveals Maintenon's political intelligence and her understanding that her own security depended partly on maintaining proper respect for royal marriage, even though she had benefited from Louis's adultery and was now his secret wife. By urging Louis to honour Marie, Phaedruse's memory, Maintenon was actually strengthening the institution of marriage that legitimised her own secret wedding to Louis, and by framing her request in terms of both Christian charity and political wisdom, she made it difficult for Louis to refuse without seeming irreligious and politically short-sighted. Now let me tell you about letters from Russian royal mistresses, because the Russian imperial court had its own traditions and scandals. Let me tell you about Ekaterina Dolgorukova, Princess Yurievskaya, who was the mistress and eventual morganatic wife of Tsar Alexander II of Russia. According to research by Professor Edvard Radzinski, whose biography of Alexander II examines his reign and his relationship with Ekaterina, the Tsar met Ekaterina when she was a teenage girl at court, became obsessed with her, and conducted a secret affair with her for years, while his wife, Empress Maria Alexandrovna, was still alive. Ekaterina's letters to Alexander II, some preserved in Russian archives, and analysed by Professor Radzinski, reveal a young woman who was genuinely in love with the Tsar, but who also lived in constant fear of discovery and scandal. In a letter from 1867, when Ekaterina was about 20 years old and had already borne Alexander a child in secret, she wrote, "My beloved Sasha, I write in tears, terrified that our secret will be discovered and that I will be ruined. The baby cries constantly, and I fear that someone will hear and ask questions I cannot answer. I am trapped in this apartment you have provided, unable to go out in society, unable to see my family, unable to live a normal life. I exist only for the hours when you can steal away to visit me, and those hours, precious as they are, cannot compensate for the loneliness and fear I experience the rest of the time. I love you with my whole heart, and I do not regret loving you or bearing your child. But I am afraid, my darling, afraid of being discovered, afraid of scandal, afraid of vandal, afraid of what will become of me and our child if your interest in me should ever wane. Promise me, Sasha, that you will never abandon me, that you will always protect me and our child, that no matter what happens, you will not leave me to face ruin alone. This letter, according to Professor Radzinski, reflects the precarious position of a royal mistress in 19th century Russia, where the scandal of a Tsar's adultery could have serious political consequences, and where the mistress herself had no legal protection or rights. Ekaterina lived in secret for years, bearing Alexander 4 children, all hidden from public view. Only after Empress Maria Alexandrovna's death in 1880 did Alexander marry Ekaterina morganatically, giving her the title of Princess Yurievskaya, but not making her empress. Less than a year later, Alexander II was assassinated by revolutionaries, and Ekaterina, now a widow with young children and hated by Alexander's legitimate children from his first marriage, fled Russia for France, where she lived in exile for the rest of her life. Let me tell you about letters written in code or cipher, because the need for secrecy meant that royal mistresses sometimes used sophisticated encryption to protect their correspondence. According to research by Professor Simon Singh, whose work on cryptography examines historical codes, royal lovers used various methods to hide the content of their letters, from simple substitution ciphers to more complex systems involving codebooks and prearranged signals. Let me tell you about the cipher system that King Charles II of England and one of his mistresses, whose identity is uncertain, but who may have been Louise de Keroualle, Duchess of Portsmouth, used for particularly sensitive correspondence. According to research by Professor Alan Marshall from the University of Bath, whose work on Stuart espionage examines intelligence gathering, Charles II had access to skilled cryptographers and used coded messages for diplomatic and intelligence purposes, and he apparently extended this practice to some of his romantic correspondence. One letter preserved in the British Library, analysed by Professor Marshall and dating from around 1675, appears to be a love letter in cipher. The letter, once decoded using a key that was discovered in Charles II's papers, reads, "My dearest heart, the matter we discussed regarding the French pension has been successfully concluded. The amount will be as we hoped, and you will receive your portion in the manner we agreed upon. This must remain absolutely secret, for if Parliament learns that I am receiving French money, they will create a crisis that could threaten my throne. Trust that I am taking every precaution to ensure our arrangement remains undiscovered. In other news, I count the hours until Wednesday evening, when I can see you. The time we spend apart feels like a desert of loneliness, and only your presence brings water to my parched soul. Until Wednesday, I remain entirely yours." This letter, according to Professor Marshall, demonstrates how royal mistresses could be involved in secret diplomatic and financial arrangements that had political implications far beyond mere romance. The reference to a French pension suggests that Charles II was receiving money from Louis XIV of France, a fact that would have been politically explosive if discovered, and that the mistress was receiving a portion of this money, making her complicit in what amounted to treasonous dealings with a foreign power. The combination of political conspiracy and romantic declaration in a single encoded letter shows how thoroughly intertwined love and politics were in royal mistress relationships. Now let me tell you about letters that were intercepted and caused scandals, because the danger of intercepted correspondence was always present and sometimes resulted in disaster for mistresses and kings alike. According to research by Professor Linda Colley from Princeton University, whose work on British history examines political scandals, The interception and publication of private letters was a common tactic in political warfare, and royal mistress letters were particularly valuable targets because they could be used to embarrass the king, blackmail the mistress, or create public outrage. Let me tell you about the interception of letters between King George IV, then Prince of Wales, and Maria Fitzherbert, whom he married secretly in 1785 in defiance of the Royal Marriages Act. According to research by Professor E.A. Smith from the University of Reading, whose work on George IV we discussed earlier, the Prince and Mrs. Fitzherbert conducted an extensive correspondence, and some of these letters were intercepted by political enemies who hoped to use them to destroy the prince's reputation or to prove the illegal marriage. In one letter from 1786, intercepted and later published in newspapers, analysed by Professor Smith, the Prince of Wales wrote to Mrs. Fitzherbert, "My beloved wife, for that is what you are in the eyes of God, even if the law refuses to recognise our marriage. I write to assure you of my undying devotion and my determination to acknowledge you publicly as soon as circumstances allow. I know that our secret weighs on you, that you suffer from the ambiguity of your position, neither maiden nor acknowledged wife, but I beg your patience a little longer. The king, my father, would disinherit me if he learned of our marriage, and I cannot risk losing the throne that will one day be mine, the throne from which I could protect you and honour you as you deserve. Trust in my love, trust in my commitment, and trust that someday I will stand before all England and proclaim you my wife." When this letter was published, according to Professor Smith, it created an enormous scandal. The prince was forced to publicly deny that he had married Mrs. Fitzherbert, effectively calling her a liar and destroying her reputation to protect his own position. The publication of the intercepted letter exposed the fragility of promises made in private correspondence and demonstrated how easily royal mistresses could be betrayed when political necessity demanded it. Mrs. Fitzherbert, according to Professor Smith, never fully recovered from the humiliation, though the prince did eventually resume their relationship after the scandal died down. Let me tell you about letters that royal mistresses wrote to their female friends, because mistresses had friendships with other women that were documented in correspondence, and that reveal how they saw themselves and their positions. According to research by Professor Amanda Vickery from Queen Mary University of London, whose work on women's letter writing examines female correspondence networks, women's letters to each other were often more honest and less guarded than their letters to men, revealing anxieties, strategies, and assessments that they wouldn't share with their royal lovers. Let me tell you about letters that Lily Langtry wrote to her friend Lady Randolph Churchill, mother of Winston Churchill. Letters preserved in the Churchill archives and analysed by Professor Vickery. In a letter from 1882, shortly after Lily's relationship with the Prince of Wales had ended, Lily wrote, "Dearest Jenny, I am exhausted from the effort of maintaining appearances. Everyone knows that Bertie has moved on to other interests, but I must pretend not to care, must smile at parties and act as though nothing has changed, when in reality I am terrified about my future. What am I to do? I have no husband to return to, having effectively destroyed that marriage. I have no family support, having scandalised them all. I have only my notoriety as the Prince of Wales's former mistress, and I must somehow convert that notoriety into a career that can support me. Everyone says I should go on the stage, but Jenny, I have no training, no real talent that I know of. What I have is beauty and social connections, and a certain amount of desperate courage. Will that be enough? I confess I am frightened, more frightened than I have ever been. When I was with Bertie, I felt secure. Now I feel as though I am walking a tightrope with no safety net below. Advise me, dear friend, for I am quite lost." This letter, according to Professor Vickery, reveals a completely different Lily Langtry from the confident, pragmatic woman whose letters to the Prince of Wales asked for help launching her career. To her female friend, Lily admitted fear, uncertainty, and vulnerability. showing how the public performance of confidence masked private anxiety. The letter also shows how important female friendship networks were for royal mistresses, providing emotional support and practical advice that helped women navigate the uncertain terrain of life after royal favour ended. Now let me tell you about the role of confessors and spiritual advisors in the lives of Catholic royal mistresses, and how some mistresses conducted correspondence with priests that reveals their spiritual struggles with their positions. According to research by Professor John W. O'Malley from Georgetown University, whose work on Catholic history examines religious practice, many Catholic royal mistresses were conflicted about their relationships, believing that they were living in mortal sin, but unable or unwilling to give up the security and luxury that came with being a royal favourite. Let me tell you about letters from Madame de Montespan to her confessor, Father Lachaise, who was also Louis XIV's confessor, letters that document her increasing spiritual anxiety as she aged and began to fear for her soul. According to research by Professor Lisa Hilton from Oxford University, whose work on Montespan we discussed earlier, Montespan in her later years became obsessed with gaining absolution for her years as Louis XIV's mistress, but she was caught in a theological bind. The Church would not grant absolution unless she ended the sinful relationship, but ending the relationship would mean losing her position, her income, and her access to her children. In a letter from 1680, analysed by Professor Hilton and preserved in church archives, Montespan wrote to Father Lachaise, "Monday Picia, I write in desperation, seeking guidance for my tormented soul. You know the nature of my relationship with the king, and you know that the Church considers it adultery and mortal sin. I have confessed this sin many times, and yet I continue in it, making my confessions worthless, and my soul more imperialed with each passing day. I want to repent, Father. I want to leave the king and retire to a convent and spend my remaining years in prayer and penance. But when I consider what that would mean, losing my children who are being raised at court, losing all security for my old age, becoming dependent on the king's charity rather than his love, I find I cannot do it. I am trapped, Father, between my terror of damnation and my terror of destitution. Can you offer me no compromise, no way to save my soul without destroying my life? Can I not somehow remain with the king but in a chaste friendship? Would God accept such an arrangement as repentance? I beg you for guidance, for I am lost." This letter, according to Professor Hilton, reveals the genuine spiritual distress that some Catholic royal mistresses experienced. Caught between religious belief and practical reality, Father Lachaise apparently advised Montespan that she must end the sexual relationship with Louis XIV to receive absolution, but that she could maintain a friendship with him. According to Professor Hilton, Montespan did attempt this, and by the early 1680s her sexual relationship with Louis had ended, though she remained at court and maintained influence through her role as mother of the king's legitimised children. But whether this compromise truly brought Montespan spiritual peace is unclear from the historical record. Let me tell you about letters that documented the education and upbringing of illegitimate royal children, because royal mistresses often played active roles in ensuring their children received proper education and advantageous marriages, and the correspondence related to these efforts reveals maternal concern mixed with practical calculation. According to research by Professor Clarissa Campbell Orr from Anglia Ruskin University, whose work on royal illegitimacy we discussed earlier, royal bastards required careful management to ensure they received the benefits of royal parentage without threatening the succession of legitimate children. Let me tell you about letters from Nell Gwyn regarding her son Charles Beauclerk, who became the Duke of St Albans. According to research by Professor John Harold Wilson, whose work on Nell Gwyn we've discussed extensively, Nell wrote numerous letters to Charles II and to various nobles and tutors involved in her son's upbringing, letters that show her determination to see her son properly educated and established, despite his irregular birth. In a letter from 1677, analysed by Professor Wilson and preserved in the St Albans family papers, Nell wrote to her son's tutor, "Sir, I write regarding my son Charles's education. I am aware that some at court believe that the son of an actress and orange seller does not require the classical education given to noblemen's sons. These people are fools. My son is the king's son, and he will be educated as befits a royal prince, with instruction in Latin, Greek, mathematics, history, philosophy, and all the subjects that will allow him to hold his own in any company. I may be lowborn myself, but I am not ignorant of what my son needs to succeed in the world. If his tutors are not teaching him properly, I will find new tutors who will. And if anyone suggests that my son should be given lesser treatment because his mother was an actress, you may inform them that the king himself takes great interest in his son's education and will not tolerate any negligence or condescension. My son will be educated as a duke, because that is what he will be, and I will accept nothing less." This letter, according to Professor Wilson, shows Nell's fierce maternal protectiveness and her clear-eyed understanding that her son's future depended on receiving an education that would allow him to function in aristocratic society. Despite his illegitimate birth, Charles Beauclerk was indeed created Duke of St Albans in 1684 when he was 14 years old, and he went on to have a successful career as a courtier and military officer, suggesting that Nell's insistence on proper education achieved its goal. Now, let me tell you about letters that reveal the financial arrangements between kings and mistresses, because money was always a crucial issue in these relationships. According to research by Professor Clarissa Campbell-Orr, royal mistresses received support from their royal lovers in various forms: direct cash payments, grants of property, pensions, jewels, and sometimes rights to collect certain revenues. The correspondence documenting these financial arrangements reveals how mistresses negotiated for security and how kings managed or mismanaged the financial aspects of their relationships. Let me tell you about financial letters from Barbara Villiers to Charles II, letters that show her constantly requesting, demanding, and sometimes threatening, in order to extract more money and property from the king. According to research by Professor Sonia Wynne from Oxford University, whose work on restoration court culture we've discussed, Barbara was notorious for her financial greed, accumulating a fortune in grants, pensions, and properties during her years as Charles II's favourite. In a letter from 1670, analysed by Professor Wynne and preserved in British archives, Barbara wrote to Charles, "My lord, I write to remind you that you have promised me the customs revenues from the wine imports for the next year, a promise that your treasury has apparently forgotten or is choosing to ignore. I need you to confirm this grant in writing and to order your officials to make the payments promptly. You know that I have enormous expenses, my household to maintain, my children to support, my position at court to uphold. The dresses alone cost a fortune, and you know that I must dress magnificently to reflect credit on you. I cannot maintain my position on the inadequate allowance that is currently being paid. Either you increase my income substantially, or you will see me forced to economize in ways that will embarrass us both. I do not make this threat lightly, my dear. I have always been generous with my affections, and have asked for nothing that you could not easily afford, but I will not be taken for granted or treated as though my needs are unimportant. See to this matter immediately, or I shall be forced to take actions that you will find most unpleasant." This letter, according to Professor Wynne, shows Barbara Villiers at her most demanding, using a combination of justification. Her expenses are legitimate, flattery. She dresses magnificently to reflect credit on Charles, and threat. She will create problems if her demands aren't met. Charles II apparently did grant her the customs revenues she requested, because Barbara continued to accumulate wealth throughout their relationship and died one of the richest women in England. Let me tell you about the letters written during the final illnesses of kings, as royal mistresses dealt with the approaching end of their protectors and patrons. According to research by Professor John Miller from Queen Mary University of London, whose work on Stuart kings examines their deaths, The final illnesses of kings created crises for their mistresses, who had to balance grief for the dying man with practical concerns about their own futures. Let me tell you about the letters of Louise de Querouaille, Duchess of Portsmouth, during the final illness of King Charles II in February 1685. According to research by Professor Miller, Louise was genuinely distraught at Charles's illness, but she was also acutely aware that Charles's death would end her position and income, and that his brother James, who would become king, had never liked her and would certainly not continue her allowance. In a letter from the 5th of February 1685, the day before Charles II died, analysed by Professor Miller and preserved in French archives, Louise wrote to the French ambassador, "Monsieur, the king is dying, and I am beside myself with grief and terror. Grief for the man I have loved for 15 years, terror for my own future. The Duke of York has made clear that he will not continue my pension when he becomes king. I have been French, Catholic, and too close to the king for the Duke's comfort. When the king dies, I will lose everything, my apartments, my income, my position at court, perhaps even my safety, if the English decide to blame me for the king's French policies. I need France to protect me. I need the assurances that when I must flee England, France will receive me, will provide me an income, will allow me to live in security. Can you obtain such assurances from His Majesty King Louis? I have served French interests faithfully during my time in England, and now I need France to repay that service by ensuring my survival. The king is dying, and I must think of my future even as my heart breaks. Please, monsieur, help me." This letter, according to Professor Miller, shows Louise de Querouaille at her most vulnerable, simultaneously grieving for Charles II and desperately trying to secure her future. She did flee to France after Charles's death, and Louis XIV did provide her a pension that allowed her to live comfortably in France until her own death in 1734. But the letter reveals the cold reality that royal mistresses faced. When the king died, everything ended, and survival required planning, even in moments of grief. Now let me tell you about letters defending against accusations, because royal mistresses were often accused of various crimes and misdeeds, from witchcraft to poisoning to political treason, and their defensive letters reveal both their vulnerability to false charges and their skill at defending themselves. According to research by Professor Robin Briggs from Oxford University, whose work on witchcraft accusations examines early modern Europe, women who had power or influence, including royal mistresses, were particularly vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft when their enemies wanted to destroy them. Let me tell you about letters from Madame de Montespan defending herself against accusations related to the affair of the poisons that we discussed earlier. According to research by Professor Anne Somerset from Cambridge University, Montespan wrote desperate letters to Louis XIV and to various officials trying to clear herself of the accusations that she had participated in black masses and poisoning plots. In one letter from 1680, analysed by Professor Somerset and preserved in French legal records, Montespan wrote to Louis XIV, "Sire, I write to defend my honour and my life against the monstrous accusations that have been made against me. They say that I consulted with fortune, tellers and poisoners, that I participated in satanic rituals, that I plotted to poison you or your family. These accusations are complete lies, fabrications by my enemies who seek to destroy me out of jealousy and malice. I swear to you before God, who sees into all hearts, that I have never sought to harm you or anyone else through witchcraft or poison. I have consulted fortune tellers. I admit that, as many women at court do, seeking to know if I would keep your affections. This was foolish and perhaps sinful, but it was not criminal. I may have purchased love potions and aphrodisiacs, hoping they would help me maintain my beauty and your interest. But I never participated in black masses, never harmed children, never plotted murder. I beg you, sire, do not believe these lies. Do not destroy me based on the testimony of criminals and madwomen who will say anything to save themselves. I have been your faithful companion for over a decade. I have borne your children. I have loved you truly. Do not let malicious lies destroy everything we have built together. This letter, according to Professor Somerset, shows Montespan at her most desperate, trying to admit to minor offences, consulting fortune tellers, buying love potions, while denying the more serious accusations, black masses, poisoning plots, child sacrifice. Whether Montespan was truly innocent or guilty of the more serious charges remains debated by historians, but the letter reveals her terror at the accusations and her awareness that even being investigated could destroy her position with Louis XI, whether she was convicted or not. Louis ultimately chose not to allow Montespan to be formally investigated or arrested, possibly because he believed in her innocence, possibly because he wanted to protect his children by her, or possibly because he feared the scandal that would result from publicly acknowledging that his former mistress might have been involved in such horrific crimes. Let me tell you about letters regarding the marriages of illegitimate royal children, because arranging advantageous marriages for their children was one of the most important tasks that royal mistresses undertook, and the correspondence related to these marriage negotiations reveals maternal ambition, political calculation, and the complex status of royal bastards. According to research by Professor Clarissa Campbell Orr from Anglia Ruskin University, illegitimate royal children occupied an ambiguous social position. They had royal blood and often substantial wealth, making them attractive marriage prospects. But their illegitimate birth made many aristocratic families reluctant to accept them as spouses. Let me tell you about correspondence from Barbara Villiers negotiating the marriage of her daughter by Charles II, Charlotte Fitzroy, to the Earl of Lichfield. According to research by Professor Sonia Wynne from Oxford University, Barbara worked hard to secure aristocratic marriages for her children, using her influence with Charles II to pressure nobles into accepting her illegitimate daughters as wives for their sons. In a letter from 1677, analysed by Professor Wynne and preserved in family archives, Barbara wrote to the Earl of Lichfield, "My lord, I write to discuss the possibility of a marriage between your son and my daughter Charlotte. I know that some might object to such a match on the grounds that Charlotte's birth was irregular, but I would ask you to consider what she brings to this union: royal blood, a substantial dowry that the king has promised to provide, connections to the court that will benefit your family politically, and beauty, intelligence, and good character that will make her an excellent wife and mother. The king takes a great interest in his daughter's future and would look favourably upon any family that welcomed her into their line. I trust you will give this proposal the serious consideration it deserves, and that you will not allow outdated prejudices about legitimacy to blind you to the advantages this match would bring to your house." This letter, according to Professor Wynne, combines bribery, the substantial dowry, veiled threat, the king's interest and potential favour, and direct appeal to practical advantage. The Earl of Lichfield's family did eventually agree to the match, suggesting that Barbara's persuasive arguments and the king's support overcame any reluctance about accepting an illegitimate daughter as a daughter-in-law. Charlotte Fitzroy became Countess of Lichfield and had a successful life, bearing numerous children and becoming the ancestor of many prominent English aristocratic families. Now let me tell you about Scandinavian royal mistresses, because the Nordic courts also had their own traditions and scandals. Let me tell you about Kira Ivanovna, who was the mistress of King Christian IV of Denmark in the early 17th century. According to research by Professor Gunnar Lind from the University of Copenhagen, whose work on Christian IV examines his reign, Kira was the daughter of a minor Danish nobleman and became Christian's mistress after his first wife's death, bearing him 12 children and effectively functioning as his unofficial second wife for over 2 decades. Kira's letters to Christian IV, some preserved in Danish archives and analysed by Professor Lind, reveal a woman who was secure in the king's affection, but who constantly worried about her children's futures. In a letter from 1635, Kira wrote to Christian, "My dear lord, I write regarding our children and their need for proper recognition and provision. We have 12 beautiful children together, and while you have been generous to them, they still do not have the secure positions that legitimate children would enjoy. Our sons need official appointments and incomes that will support them throughout their lives. Our daughters need proper dowries so that they can make good marriages. I do not ask these things for myself, for I am content with the life you have given me. But for our children, I must be their advocate and protector. They are your blood, your heirs in all but name, and they deserve to be treated accordingly. I beg you to formally acknowledge all our children, to grant them titles and lands, to ensure their futures before either of us dies, and they are left vulnerable to the whims of your legitimate children, who may not be as generous or fair-minded as we would hope. BTP. Boxay Bopite. This letter, according to Professor Lind, reflects the primary concern of many royal mistresses, securing provision for their children. Kira herself was apparently secure in Christian's affection and had no need to worry about her own maintenance during the king's lifetime, but she understood that her illegitimate children would be vulnerable after Christian's death, unless they had been given formal titles, lands and positions that couldn't easily be taken away by Christian's legitimate heirs. Christian Ivorth did grant several of his illegitimate sons noble titles and positions, though not all of Kira's 12 children received equal provision, and after Christian's death in 1648, Kira and her children did face some difficulties from Christian's legitimate son and successor Frederick III. Let me tell you about letters written by royal mistresses after they had been cast aside, as they attempted to navigate life after losing royal favour. According to research by Professor Amanda Foreman from Cambridge University, whose work on aristocratic women we've discussed, the transition from royal favourite to rejected former mistress was often brutal, and the letters written during this transition reveal desperation, anger, and sometimes remarkable resilience. Let me tell you about letters from Diane de Poictiers immediately after Henry II's death in 1559, when Henry's widow Queen Catherine de Medici, who had hated Diane throughout Henry's reign, moved quickly to strip Diane of her properties and positions. According to research by Professor Ivan Clulas, whose biography of Diane we've discussed, Diane wrote multiple letters to Catherine de Medici and to Henry's successor, King Francis II, trying to defend her right to keep properties that Henry had granted her. In a letter from August 1559, just weeks after Henry's death, analysed by Professor Clulas and preserved in French archives, Diane wrote to Catherine de Medici, "Madame, I write to you at a time of great sorrow for both of us. Having lost the man who was husband to you and dear friend to me, I know that you have long resented my relationship with the late king, and I understand that resentment, though I would ask you to believe that I never sought to usurp your position as queen, or to diminish your dignity in any way. But now I must address a practical matter, the Chateau of Chenonceau, which the late king granted to me, and which you now demand I return to the crown. Madame, this property was a legal gift, freely made and properly documented. It is mine by law and by the king's will, and I respectfully decline to surrender it simply because you believe my relationship with your late husband was improper. I earned Chenonceau through years of faithful service to the king and to France, through my counsel and my companionship during the years when you chose to distance yourself from court. If you wish to contest my ownership, you may do so through legal means, but I will not simply hand over what is rightfully mine out of misplaced guilt or fear." This letter, according to Professor Clulas, reveals Diane's attempt to maintain dignity and assert her legal rights even as her power evaporated with Henry's death. Catherine de Medici was not persuaded by legal arguments and used her power as Queen Mother to force Diane to exchange Chenonceau for another less valuable property. Diane spent her final years at the Struttertow of Annette, stripped of most of her political power, but still wealthy and able to maintain a comfortable retirement. Her letters from this period, according to Professor Clulas, show a woman coming to terms with the end of her public life and finding some peace in retirement. though she never fully accepted that Catherine had the right to take Chenonceau from her. Now let me tell you about letters discussing inheritance disputes, because the children of royal mistresses often fought for recognition and inheritance, and mistresses sometimes had to write letters supporting their children's claims or defending against challenges to properties they had accumulated. According to research by Professor Nancy Goldstone from the University of Cambridge, whose work on medieval and Renaissance women examines property rights, women's property rights were always precarious, and this was especially true for royal mistresses, whose property often came from royal grants that could be challenged after the king's death. Let me tell you about letters from Rosamond Clifford, who was the mistress of King Henry II of England in the 12th century and whose story became legendary. According to research by Professor Elizabeth Hallam from the University of London, whose work on Angevin England examines Henry II's, historical records about Rosamond are scarce and much of what is known about her is actually legend. But there are some surviving documents related to properties that Henry granted to Rosamond and to provision for a son she allegedly bore him. One document from 1176, analysed by Professor Hallam and preserved in English Royal Archives, records a grant of land to Rosa, daughter of Walter de Clifford, with the notation that the grant is made for services rendered to the king. While this document doesn't explicitly identify Rosamond as Henry's mistress or mention any letters she wrote, Professor Hallam notes that such cautious language was typical for grants to royal mistresses, which had to be publicly justified in neutral terms even when everyone understood the real nature of the relationship. Whether Rosamond wrote letters to Henry II, and what those letters might have contained, is unknown, as any correspondence between them would have been destroyed centuries ago. But the existence of this property grant, according to Professor Hallam, suggests that, like mistresses in later centuries, Rosamond was concerned with securing provision for herself and any children she had by Henry, and that she successfully convinced the king to make such provision. The legend of Rosamond Clifford, which developed in the centuries after her death, portrays her as poisoned by Henry's jealous wife Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, though there is no historical evidence for this. But the legend itself reveals cultural assumptions about royal mistresses, that they were beautiful and tragic, that they were hated by queens, that they often met bad ends when royal protection failed. Let me tell you about correspondence from the 20th century that reveals how the role of royal mistress evolved in the age of mass media and changing social mores. Let me tell you about Wallis Simpson and Edward VIII again, but this time focusing on letters written after Edward's abdication, when Wallis was dealing with the consequences of having caused a king to give up his throne for her. According to research by Professor Philip Ziegler, whose work on Edward VIII we've discussed, Wallis wrote numerous letters in the years after the abdication expressing regret, not necessarily about her relationship with Edward, but about how that relationship had played out publicly and about the price Edward had paid. In a letter from 1938 to a friend in America, analysed by Professor Ziegler and preserved in private archives, Wallis wrote, "I never imagined it would come to this, that David would actually abdicate for me. I thought that when faced with the choice between the throne and me, he would choose the throne as any sensible man would. I would have been hurt, certainly, but I would have understood. A king doesn't give up his crown for a twice-divorced American woman, no matter how much he thinks he loves her. That is not how the world works, but David did it anyway, and now we're both paying the price. He has lost everything that mattered to him, his position, his purpose, his country, and I am the most hated woman in Britain, blamed for stealing their king, for destroying the monarchy, for every problem in the world. People write to me with such venom, such hatred. They call me a witch, a Jezebel, every foul name imaginable. Sometimes I wonder if it would have been better if I had left when I had the chance, before things went so far that there was no turning back. But it is too late now. We're married, we're exiled. and we must make the best of this life we've created together. This letter, according to Professor Ziegler, reveals Wallis's complicated feelings about the abdication and its aftermath. She seems to have genuinely not expected Edward to abdicate, suggesting either that she was naive about his devotion or that she had been playing a game that went further than she intended. And, while she doesn't express regret about marrying Edward, she clearly regrets the public hatred and the loss of everything Edward had been. Unlike royal mistresses of earlier centuries who generally understood and accepted that they would be condemned by respectable society, Wallis seems to have hoped for acceptance, or at least tolerance, and the reality of being universally hated was harder than she had anticipated. Let me tell you about letters that attempted to manipulate public opinion, because as media became more important in the 19th and 20th centuries, some royal mistresses tried to use press and publication to shape how they were perceived by the public. According to research by Professor Kate Williams from the University of Reading, whose work on royal history examines public relations, royal mistresses in the age of mass media had to manage their public images in ways that earlier mistresses had never needed to consider. Let me tell you about Lily Langtry's use of publicity and her correspondence with journalists and theatre critics. According to research by Professor Laura Beattie, whose biography of Lily Langtry examines her career, Lily was very aware of the value of publicity and actively cultivated relationships with journalists who could write favourably about her. In a letter from 1883 to a theatre critic, analysed by Professor Betty and preserved in theatrical archives, Lily wrote, "My dear sir, I write to thank you for your kind review of my performance last night. Your words were generous and will help immensely with my career as I establish myself on the stage. I wonder if I might ask a favour when you write about me in future. Might you focus on my work as an actress rather than on my previous connection to the Prince of Wales? I am trying to build a career based on talent and hard work, and while I cannot erase my past, I would prefer to be judged on my present achievements rather than on old gossip. I understand that my history makes good copy, but it also makes it difficult for people to take me seriously as an artist. If you could help me by emphasizing my theatrical work over my personal history, I would be very grateful." This letter, according to Professor Batty, shows Lily attempting to manage her public image and to transition from being known primarily as the Prince of Wales's former mistress to being known as a working actress. She had some success in this effort, according to Professor Beattie, and her career on stage lasted for decades, though she was never able to completely escape being defined by her relationship with Edward VII. The letter reveals that by the late 19th century, royal mistresses were actively thinking about public relations and trying to shape media coverage rather than simply accepting whatever was written about them. Now, let me tell you about letters from royal mistresses who became writers or memoirists themselves, turning their experiences into published works that gave them financial independence and a measure of control over their own narratives. We've already discussed Harriet Wilson and her scandalous memoirs, but let me tell you about other examples of royal mistresses who wrote. Let me tell you about Madame de Pompadour's literary activities and her correspondence with Voltaire and other Enlightenment intellectuals. According to research by Professor Dinar Goodman from the University of Michigan, whose work on Enlightenment salons examines Pompadour's cultural role, Pompadour was an active participant in the intellectual life of her time, corresponding with philosophers, supporting artists and writers, and even trying her hand at writing herself. In a letter from 1750 to Voltaire, analysed by Professor Goodman and preserved in the Voltaire archives, Pompadour wrote, "My dear Voltaire, I write to thank you for your latest play, which I found both witty and wise. I wish I had your talent for writing, but alas, I am merely an appreciator of genius rather than a creator of it. My role is to support artists like yourself, to provide patronage and protection so that you may create the works that will enlighten our age. Some might say that a royal mistress should confine herself to beautifying her appearance and pleasing the king, but I believe we can and should aim higher. Why should I not use my position to advance learning and art? Why should I not correspond with the greatest minds of the age and try to learn from them? The king supports my intellectual pursuits, understanding that a cultivated mind is more valuable than mere physical beauty, which fades while wisdom endures. I hope you will continue to honour me with your friendship and your correspondence, for your letters educate me and inspire me to be better than I might otherwise be. This letter, according to Professor Goodman, shows Pompadour positioning herself as an intellectual patron and participant rather than merely as a royal mistress. By corresponding with Voltaire and other Enlightenment figures, by supporting their work and engaging with their ideas, Pompadour was creating a role for herself that transcended the traditional limits of being the king's mistress. She was making herself important, not just to Louis XV, but to French culture more broadly, and her letters to intellectuals formed part of the documented record of the French Enlightenment. Let me tell you about letters that reveal the daily practicalities of being a royal mistress, the mundane logistics of arranging meetings, managing servants, dealing with pregnancies, handling illnesses, and all the ordinary details that existed alongside the grand passion and political intrigue. According to research by Professor Amanda Vickery from Queen Mary University of London, whose work on women's daily lives examines domestic correspondence, women's letters often reveal much about daily realities that don't appear in public records or political correspondence. Let me tell you about prosaic letters from Barbara Villiers to Charles II, letters that deal not with passion or politics but with practical household matters. According to research by Professor Sonia Wynne, among Barbara's surviving letters are many dealing with servants, expenses, and logistics. In one brief note from 1668, analysed by Professor Wynne and preserved in British archives, Barbara wrote to Charles, "My dear Lord, I write to inform you that the cook you sent to my household is unsatisfactory, and I have dismissed him. Please send a replacement, someone who can actually cook edible food rather than the slop that passes for cuisine in your palace. Also, the carriage you provided has a broken wheel, and I need funds to repair it immediately, as I cannot appear at court in a broken-down carriage without looking ridiculous. And I am out of the face powder I prefer, which must be imported from France. Can you arrange for more to be sent? These are small matters, I know, but they require attention. Your loving Barbara, who would love you more if you would attend to these domestic details." This letter, according to Professor Wynne, reveals a completely different aspect of the royal mistress relationship than the passionate love letters or political correspondence we've mostly discussed. Barbara is essentially acting as the manager of a household, dealing with servants and supplies and maintenance, and she expects Charles to provide the resources necessary to run that household properly. The casual, almost complaining tone suggests a level of comfortable familiarity where Barbara felt no need to be seductive or manipulative. She could just tell Charles plainly what she needed and expect him to provide it. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, I want you to appreciate the freedom you have to express your feelings openly, to love whom you choose without hiding it in coded language or secret correspondence, to build relationships that are recognized and respected rather than condemned as scandalous. The women whose letters we've read tonight lived in times when their loves were crimes, when their relationships could never be legitimized, when their only power came from their ability to maintain a king's interest and affection through whatever means they could devise. And I want you to think about the courage it took to write these letters, to put feelings on paper knowing that discovery could mean ruin, to express love knowing that it might not last, to reveal vulnerability to men who had absolute power over them, to use words as weapons and shields and lifelines in situations where they had few other resources. These women were not just passive recipients of royal favour. They were active agents using every skill they had, including their ability to write compelling, moving, strategic letters, to survive and sometimes to thrive in positions that society defined as shameful, but that gave them access to power and influence they could get no other way. Sweet dreams, dear friends, and may you wake tomorrow with renewed appreciation for the power of words to express love. maintain connections, advance causes, and reveal the complexity of human hearts across the centuries. May you honor the memory of these women by using your freedom to write and speak and love openly, by refusing to be ashamed of genuine feeling, and by understanding that love and power have always been intertwined in ways both beautiful and troubling. Sleep well, knowing that you are the inheritor of a legacy of women's written words, that the freedom to express your feelings openly was purchased in part through the secret correspondence of women who had to hide their loves and code their messages, and that every love letter you write or receive is a small act of rebellion against the forces that tried to silence women's voices and deny their agency throughout history. And may you remember, as you drift off to sleep, that behind every scandal there are human beings with beating hearts and complex motives, that the women we've met tonight were not just mistresses or lovers, but writers, strategists, survivors, and occasionally genuine romantics who dared to love kings and to put that love into words that have lasted long after the kings themselves have been forgotten. Good night, and sweet dreams, and may your own love letters, whether written or spoken or simply felt, be filled with the honesty, courage, and passion that these women showed in their most private correspondence.